Colton Vance threw the envelope across the lawyer's desk before the old man had finished reading the second paragraph. "That's not a will," Colton said. "That's a punishment." The lawyer, a thin man named Aldrich, who had been serving the Vance family for 30 years, did not flinch. He had expected this. He picked the envelope up from the floor, smoothed it against the desk, and continued reading as if Colton had not moved at all. The fire in this corner of the office popped. Outside, the wind off the Montana plain pressed against the glass like something trying to get in. "The terms are clear," Aldrich said when he finished. "You marry Naomi Harlow within 30 days of your grandfather's death, or the ranch and all associated holdings pass entirely to the Cattlemen's Trust of Helena. There is no alternative clause. There is no amendment. Your grandfather was very specific." Colton stood at the window with his back to the room. He was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that weather had already begun to mark. He had run the Vance Ranch's day-to-day operations for 6 years. He had driven cattle through 3 droughts. He had renegotiated the bank notes twice and kept the creditors at arm's length through sheer refusal to acknowledge that they had any power over him. He was not a man who accepted conditions from anyone, but his grandfather was dead, and the old man had known exactly what he was doing. "Who is she?" Colton said. Not a question, a demand. "Naomi Harlow, daughter of Fletcher Harlow, the wheat farmer out past Ridgeline Creek. Fletcher passed last spring. She's been managing what's left of his property alone since." Colton turned from the window. "A wheat farmer's daughter." "Yes. My grandfather wanted me to marry a wheat farmer's daughter." Aldrich set the papers down and folded his hands. "Your grandfather wanted you to marry a woman of substance and practicality." Those were his words in an earlier draft. He believed Miss Harlow to be exactly that. "She's fat," Colton said flatly. "The whole county knows her. They call her—" "I know what they call her," Aldrich said, and his voice dropped just enough that Colton stopped. "And I suspect your grandfather knew too. He chose her anyway." There was a long silence. The fire popped again. "You have 29 days," Aldrich said. "I'd recommend not waiting until the 29th. Naomi Harlow heard about the will before Colton's rider even reached her door. That was the nature of a small frontier town. Word traveled faster than horses. By the time she was pulling on her coat to step outside and meet the man on the porch, she had already heard 2 versions of what the Vance will contained, and both of them had her name in them, and both of them were delivered to her with the kind of poorly concealed pity that made her want to close the door and not open it again. She did not close the door. She never had. The writer was a young ranch hand she didn't recognize, with red ears from the cold, and an expression that suggested he found this errand beneath him. He handed her a sealed letter without dismounting. "Mr. Vance requests your presence at the ranch house Thursday morning," he said. 9 o'clock. "Does he?" Naomi said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the letter. It was heavy paper, the kind the Vance family used for legal correspondence. Her name was written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize, probably the lawyer's. "Tell Mr. Vance I'll be there," she said. The writer nodded, turned his horse, and was gone before she had finished speaking. She stood on the porch a moment longer than she needed to, holding the letter, looking out at what remained of her father's land. 2 horses, a barn that needed re-roofing, 40 acres of depleted soil that had given her father everything it had and then stopped giving. She was 27 years old, and she owed the bank $112 she did not have. She went inside and read the letter by the stove. It was not from Colton Vance. It was from Aldrich, the lawyer. It laid out the terms with the kind of precise, bloodless language that lawyers favored when they wanted you to understand that emotion had no place in the transaction. The Vance grandfather, one Harold Emmett Vance, had specified her by name. The marriage was to occur within 30 days of his death. In exchange, she would receive full legal standing as Colton Vance's wife, residence at the Vance Ranch, and a personal bequest of $300 from Harold's estate, independent of the ranch itself. $300, independent of whatever her husband decided to do or not do. Harold Vance had thought of that. She appreciated it more than she could say. She set the letter on the table and looked at it for a long time. She had met Harold Vance twice in her life. Once when she was 12, when he had come to buy wheat from her father and had stayed for supper and talked to her about the grazing patterns on the eastern plain like she was a grown person worth talking to. And once, 4 years ago, when she had approached him about a small loan to save her father's crop after a hailstorm. He hadn't given her the loan, but he had told her quietly that she had a better understanding of land management than half the men he employed, and that was not a compliment he gave to anyone. She hadn't thought about that conversation since. Now she thought about it quite a lot. The wedding was held on a Tuesday in the office of a justice of the peace named Grover, who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke the words so quickly that Naomi almost missed the moment it became official. There were no flowers. There was no celebration. Colton Vance stood beside her in his good coat and said what he was required to say in a voice that carried no more warmth than a fence post, and she said what she was required to say, and that was that. The town had turned out anyway. Not for the ceremony, they were not invited, but for the spectacle of watching the two of them emerge from Grover's office afterward. People stood on the boardwalk in the December cold with their hands shoved in their pockets, and they looked, and some of them talked without bothering to lower their voices. Naomi heard it. She was not deaf, and she was not a fool, and she had been hearing things like it her entire life. She heard the laughter from the group of men outside the feed store, and she heard what the two women near the milliners said to each other, and she heard young Dale Pruitt, who had once asked her to dance at the Harvest Social and then laughed with his friends when she said yes, say something that made the men around him double over. She kept walking. She had learned, a long time ago, that there was no response to that kind of meanness that improved the situation. You answered it with silence and with time, and time was the only thing she had plenty of. Colton said nothing either. He was walking beside her toward the wagon, and she could not tell whether his silence was solidarity or indifference, and she suspected it was indifference, and she decided that was fine. She had not come into this expecting a partner. She had come into this because the alternative was losing the last of her father's land to the bank and having nowhere to go in the worst winter Montana had seen in a decade. He helped her up onto the wagon seat. She was not sure if he did it out of habit or manners or because people were watching. It didn't matter. She took hold of the rail and settled herself, and he climbed up beside her, and they rode out of town without speaking. They were 3 miles from town before he said anything. "I want you to understand something," Colton said, his eyes on the road. "This was not my choice." "I know that," Naomi said. "The ranch is mine. The decisions are mine. What my grandfather put in that will doesn't change how things operate." "I understand." He glanced at her sideways, like he was expecting her to argue or cry or say something that required managing. She didn't. She was watching the road ahead and the line of the hills to the northwest, trying to orient herself to land she had only seen from a distance. "Good," he said, and looked away again. She let the silence run for another mile or so. Then she said, "How bad is the debt?" He stiffened. She felt it even from the distance between them on the bench. "That's ranch business," he said. "I'm your wife." "On paper." She turned and looked at him directly. He was staring ahead, jaw set, the way men looked when they were determined not to be moved by something. She had seen that look on her father's face 100 times, usually right before her father's stubbornness got them into another problem. "On paper is what the bank cares about," she said. "If the ranch fails, it fails for both of us. I'd rather know what we're dealing with." He said nothing for a long time. The wagon moved through the gray afternoon. A hawk crossed the road far ahead and disappeared into the brush. $60,000, he said finally. "Give or take." She did not let her expression change. "When is the next note due?" "March." "And what do we have liquid?" He looked at her then, really looked, for the first time since they'd met in Grover's office. "You know what liquid means." "My father ran a farm," she said. "He wasn't good at it, but I watched him try for 20 years. I know what liquid means." Another silence. The ranch road forked ahead, and he took the left branch without slowing. In the distance, she could see the roofline of the main house. "Not enough," he said. The Vance ranch was bigger than she had imagined and in worse shape than she had hoped. She didn't say that. She kept her observations to herself the way she had learned to keep most things, cataloged, noted, filed away for later. She spent the first week walking the land when Colton wasn't watching, which was most of the time because he was occupied with the appearance of managing things, and she was occupied with actually looking at them. What she saw was not encouraging. The eastern pasture was overgrazed to bare dirt in patches. The water line from the creek had been running the same route for 30 years and had silted up in 3 places that nobody had bothered to clear. The cattle themselves were decent stock, Hereford crosses mostly, but they were being fed and rotated on a schedule that made no sense to her, concentrated in the areas that needed rest and kept away from the sections that had recovered. It was the kind of management that happened when men did things the way they'd always been done and mistook familiarity for wisdom. She also saw the books, or enough of them to understand the shape of the problem. Colton hadn't shown them to her. His foreman, a rangy, weathered man named Dupree, who had been with the Vance family for 15 years, had left the ledger on the kitchen table one morning, she suspected by accident, and she had read it in the 20 minutes before anyone came back into the room. The ranch had been losing ground for 7 years, slowly at first, then faster. The last 3 had been particularly bad. Harold Vance had been propping the operation up with his personal reserves, and now Harold Vance was dead, and the reserves were nearly gone, and the banknote in March was not going to wait for sentiment. She put the ledger back exactly where she found it. That evening, she sat across the dinner table from Colton and Dupree and 2 of the senior ranch hands, and she listened to them talk about spring plans. The plans were the same plans they had made every spring, adjusted slightly for the drought, which mostly meant making fewer changes than they should have and hoping the weather cooperated. She did not say anything. It was too soon. She didn't have enough yet. Dupree watched her over his coffee cup. He was not hostile, exactly. He was cautious the way a man was cautious around something he didn't know how to categorize. She was not what he had expected. She could see him working out what she was, and she didn't help him. After the hands left the table, Colton pushed back his chair and stood. "You don't have to sit through these dinners," he said. "You can eat in the kitchen if you'd rather." She looked up at him. "Is that what you'd prefer?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to make this easier." "Eating in the kitchen wouldn't make it easier," she said. "It would just be one more thing the hands notice and talk about, and they already have enough to say." He looked like he wanted to argue. Then he picked up his cup and left the room. And she sat at the table alone with the last of the coffee and the lamplight and the sound of the wind coming off the plain, and she thought about water tables and cattle genetics and the price of longhorn bulls in the fall market, and she thought about what March looked like from where they were standing. It looked like a cliff. The first time she spoke up at a ranch meeting, she said exactly one thing. Colton had the senior hands gathered in the barn, going over the spring calving rotation. Dupree had the map spread out on a hay bale. They were talking about concentrating the calving in the south pasture, the same way they always had. Naomi stood at the edge of the group and listened until she couldn't anymore. "The south pasture is the worst drainage on the property," she said. Every head turned. The silence was the particular kind of silence that happened when a woman said something in a room that had decided not to hear women. Dupree cleared his throat. "It's always been done in the south pasture." "The south pasture floods every time we get 2 inches of rain," she said. "In calving season, that means wet ground, which means scours, which means losing calves. If you move calving to the ridge sections above the creek, you lose less." The silence stretched. One of the hands, a big, blunt-faced man named Garrett, who had been with the ranch about as long as Dupree, let out a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "We lose less," he said, repeating her words back in a tone that made clear he found them funny. Colton looked at her. She looked back at him and waited. "We'll consider it," Colton said. They did not consider it. She knew they wouldn't, not yet. She had not expected them to. She had said it so that when the south pasture flooded in April and they lost calves, she would not have to wonder whether she should have spoken. She had spoken. The rest was on them. She went back to walking the land. She was out near the northern fence line 3 days later, in the kind of cold that turned your breath to steam and made your fingers ache inside your gloves, when she found what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. A section of fence that backed up to a low ridge, and beyond the ridge, a long sloping valley that she had not seen on any of the maps in the ranch house, sheltered from the north wind by the ridge line. Grass still standing, dried but intact, because no cattle had been run through it. A creek running along the eastern edge that showed no sign of the silting problems that plagued the main water line. She stood at the fence for a long time, memorizing it. Then she went back to the house and said nothing. There was a right time for everything, and it was not yet the right time. She was a woman who had learned patience the hard way, through years of watching her father swing between recklessness and despair while she kept the small things running and tried not to let him see how frightened she was. She knew how to wait. She knew how to gather what she needed before she moved. The ranch was collapsing. She could see it clearly, and no one else seemed able to, or willing to, or perhaps they could see it fine and had simply stopped believing anything could be done. That was its own kind of blindness, and in some ways it was worse. She went to Aldrich's office in town the following week and spent 2 hours with him going over the public records on cattle prices, land values, and the recent sales in the territory. Aldrich watched her work with an expression that shifted slowly from professional neutrality to something closer to attention. "You know," he said, when she had finished with the last of the records, "Harold told me once that he wished Colton had half the sense of the Harlow girl. I didn't know what he meant at the time." She looked up. "He said that?" "Plainly. He was not a man who spoke plainly about most things, so I remembered it." She thought about Harold Vance, the two conversations, the careful way he had written her into a will to make sure she had something that couldn't be taken from her no matter what his grandson decided to do. She thought about what that level of forethought meant, and what it suggested about what Harold had seen when he looked at the ranch, and then looked at his grandson. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for more than the records. She rode back to the ranch in the fading afternoon light, and she looked at the land the whole way, the way she always looked at it. Not with the eye of someone who owned it, because she was still deciding whether she ever would, but with the eye of someone who understood it. The land didn't care what anyone thought of her. The land only cared what she did. She could work with that. She was still sitting with the reins in her hands when Colton came out of the barn and saw her there. He stopped. She stopped. For a moment they just looked at each other across the cold yard. "Where'd you go?" he said. "Town. Aldrich's office. I was looking at the public land records." His jaw tightened slightly. "Why?" "Because I wanted to understand what we're dealing with," she said. She stepped down from the horse without waiting for him to offer a hand. "I think I do now." She led the horse into the barn, and she heard him follow, and she felt him watching her, and she did not explain herself further because she had not yet decided how much of what she knew she was willing to share with a man who was still trying to determine whether she was worth listening to. That question was his to answer. She had already answered her own. The south pasture flooded on the 14th of April. Naomi knew it before anyone came to tell her. She had been watching the sky for 3 days, tracking the way the clouds stacked up over the northern ridgeline and the way the creek ran faster each morning when she went out to check the water line. She knew what 2 inches of rain did to that particular stretch of ground, and she knew it the way she knew most things about this ranch now, quietly, without ceremony, in the margins of days when nobody was paying attention to her. Dupree came to find her in the kitchen just after dawn, his hat in his hands, his face arranged into the particular expression of a man who has to deliver bad news to someone he has not yet decided to respect. "We lost 11 calves in the night," he said. "Scours. The ground's a mess down there." Naomi set down her coffee cup. "How many are still at risk?" "Maybe 8 more. The ones that got wet before we could move them." "Move the rest of them up to the ridge sections today," she said. "All of them. Don't wait to ask Colton. Just do it. The ground up there will hold." Dupree looked at her for a moment with that measuring look he had. Then he put his hat back on. "I'll ask Colton," he said, and left. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the rain on the roof and did not say what she was thinking, which was that asking Colton would cost them another 3 hours and possibly 3 more calves, because Colton would want to see the south pasture himself and assess it himself and make the decision himself. And all of that was reasonable behavior from a man who was used to being in charge. But the calves did not care about anyone's need to be in charge. She was right about the 3 hours. She was wrong about the calves. They lost 2 more before the herd was moved, not 3. She decided not to count that as a victory. Colton came in from the pasture at midday with mud on his boots and a look on his face that she had not seen before. Not anger. Something more complicated than anger. He stood at the door of the kitchen and looked at her across the room. "You said this would happen," he said. "Yes." "At the meeting, you said the south pasture flooded." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair and looked at the floor. "Why didn't you push harder?" It was such an unexpected question that she almost said the wrong thing. She caught herself and thought about it properly before she answered. "Because you weren't ready to hear it," she said. "And pushing harder would have made you dig in. I've seen it before." "You've seen it before," he said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite read. "In who?" My father, she said. He was a proud man who didn't like being told things by his daughter, so I learned to say things once and then wait. Colton looked at her for a long moment. Then he hung his hat on the peg by the door and walked past her to the stove and poured his own coffee, which he had never done before. He had always waited for one of the hands to bring it or gone without. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. 13 calves, he said mostly to himself. 11, she said. Dupree said 11. I found 2 more this morning, the Count missed. He sat down at the table. 13. She sat down across from him. The rain was still coming down outside, steadier now. At current market prices, that's somewhere between $200 and $240 depending on what the fall buyers are paying. He looked at her. You know the current market prices. I've been reading the Helena papers when Aldrich gets done with them. He saves them for me. Something moved across his face. She watched it move and couldn't catch what it was. Aldrich saves you the papers. He's a thoughtful man. Colton drank his coffee and looked at the table. What else do you know that I don't? It was the most honest question he had ever asked her. She was careful with her answer because she understood, in the way that she understood most things about men who had been raised to lead, that this moment was fragile. He was not asking because he had decided she was smarter than him. He was asking because he was frightened and the fear had cracked something open, and if she moved too fast, the crack would close again. The eastern waterline has 3 silted sections, she said. If we don't clear them before summer, we'll lose pressure to the upper pastures during the dry months. The cattle will push toward the creek and overgraze the banks, and then we'll have erosion problems on top of the water problems. He didn't say anything. The breeding rotation hasn't changed in at least 8 years, she continued. I can tell from the stock. You've got too much inbreeding in the Hereford line. That's part of why the calves are coming in weak. And the grazing schedule concentrates the herd in the sections that need rest and keeps them out of the sections that have recovered. The silence went on long enough that she wondered if she had miscalculated. That's a lot, he said, finally. Yes. Why haven't you said any of this before? I said the south pasture, she reminded him. He made a sound. Not a laugh. Something shorter and more rueful. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. What would you do differently? If it was your decision. She looked at him carefully. Is that a real question? I don't ask questions I don't want answers to. She thought that was probably not entirely true, but she let it go. The waterline first, because that's the most immediate problem. Then the grazing rotation, because we can start that now without spending money we don't have. The breeding program takes longer and costs more, but we need to think about what bulls we're bringing in for fall. We don't have money for new bulls. Not the kind the other ranchers are buying, she said. But there's a man named Calder over in Sweetgrass County who's been trying to sell off a pair of Longhorn crosses for 2 seasons. Nobody wants them because they're not fashionable. But they're strong animals, they're disease-resistant, and they breed true. I've seen the descriptions in the cattleman's notices. Colton frowned. Longhorns. Nobody runs Longhorns anymore. Nobody runs them because they went out of fashion 15 years ago, she said. Fashion isn't the same thing as sense. He stared at her. She stared back. She was not going to apologize for that. How much is Calder asking? He said. $80 for the pair. He's desperate to move them. That's still $80 we don't have loose. I have $300, she said, from Harold's bequest. The air in the room changed. She watched him absorb it and watched the pride move across his face like weather, and she waited to see which way it broke. That money's yours, he said. I know it is. I'm choosing to put it toward the ranch. Why? She looked at him steadily. Because if the ranch fails, my $300 doesn't save me. It just means I lose everything a little more slowly. I'd rather spend it on something that might actually work. He was quiet again. The rain eased off slightly, then came back harder. I'll think about it, he said. It was not a yes, but it was not the no she had half expected, and she decided that was enough for now. She wrote to Calder in Sweetgrass County that same week, without telling Colton. Not because she was hiding it, but because she needed to know what she was dealing with before she brought it to him. The response came back 12 days later, carried by the mail rider, and it was better than she had hoped. Calder had dropped his price to $60. He was retiring in the spring, and the animals needed to be placed. She put the letter in her coat pocket and went to find Colton. I was in the far north pasture with Dupree and 2 of the hands. looking at the fence line she had been studying months earlier. She rode up and he turned and watched her come without expression. Calder will take 60, she said, without preamble. Colton looked at Dupree. Dupree looked at his boots. I haven't said yes to the Longhorns, Colton said. I know, but 60 is better than 80, and if we wait any longer, he'll find someone else. She paused. Or he won't, and we'll get them for 50. But I wouldn't count on that. Garrett, the big hand with the habit of repeating her words back in a mocking tone, was standing just behind Dupree. He made a sound in his throat. Longhorns, he said, to no one in particular. Ranch hands will love that, dealing with Longhorn temperament all winter. The temperament is manageable, Naomi said, turning to look at him directly. The Denton March is not. Garrett's expression went flat. Dupree glanced between them. Colton looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the valley below the ridge, the one she had found in January, still sitting unused, the grass dried but intact. That valley, he said. You've been looking at it. Since January, she said. What do you see in it? Winter shelter. The ridge blocks the north wind. The creek's clean. There's 3 seasons of ungrazed grass in there. It'll come back strong in spring if we manage it right. She paused. It's where I'd run the Longhorn crosses and the recovered Herefords together. Separate from the main herd until we see what the breeding produces. Dupree cleared his throat. That valley's been left alone because the trail in is narrow. Hard to move cattle through in a hurry if something goes wrong. Hard for predators to move through in a hurry too, she said. Dupree didn't have an answer to that. She had spent 3 weeks thinking about that answer, and she was not surprised it took him a moment. Colton looked at the valley again. She could see him working through it, the same way he always worked through things. Not quickly, but thoroughly, like a man who had been wrong before and was determined to be slower about committing himself. Right back to Calder, he said. Tell him we'll take them at 60. Garrett made another sound. This time, nobody responded to it. What? The Longhorns arrived in early May, and they were everything Naomi had hoped and slightly more difficult than she had advertised. They came off the transport wagon mean-tempered from the journey, horns swinging, making the kind of noise that set the Hereford crosses on edge and sent 2 of the younger ranch hands scrambling for the fence. Naomi stood in the middle of the yard watching them come down the ramp and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for months. They were magnificent, rangy and raw-boned and deeply unfashionable, with the kind of hard-forged constitution you didn't get from pampered bloodlines. The larger bull had a scar along his left shoulder from some old dispute she'd never know the origin of, and he looked at her with an intelligence in his dark eyes that she found more reassuring than anything else about the situation. They're ugly, Garrett said from the fence. They're alive, she said. That's the point. The hands named them, because hands always name things. The larger bull became Lincoln, and the smaller became Douglas, because one of the younger men thought that was funny, and it stuck. Naomi didn't mind. Named animals got looked after more carefully. She had noticed that early. She put Lincoln and Douglas in the northern valley with a selected group of the strongest Hereford cows, and she began the grazing rotation she had been designing in her head since February. She divided the main pasture into sections and moved the herd through them on a schedule that gave each section 6 weeks of rest between grazings. The hands thought it was complicated. She wrote it on a board in the barn so nobody had an excuse to confuse themselves. Dupree watched her put up the board without commenting. Then, 3 days later, she found him standing in front of it in the morning, memorizing the schedule before the day started. He didn't know she was watching. She left before he saw her. The summer was hard. It was always going to be hard. She had known that going in, and she had not pretended otherwise to Colton or to herself. The drought that had been threatening since April came in force in June, and the waterline problem she had flagged in the spring turned critical. They lost pressure to the upper pastures exactly as she had predicted, and the herd pushed toward the creek exactly as she had predicted, and Colton had to make the call to clear the silted sections of the line in the middle of the driest stretch of summer, which was the worst possible time to do it, and cost twice what it would have cost in April. He didn't say anything to her about it. She didn't say anything to him. They were getting better at that particular kind of silence, the kind that wasn't distance but acknowledgement. She was not sure when it had shifted from one to the other, but she noticed it one evening in July when she was going over the water usage numbers at the kitchen table, and he sat down across from her without being asked, and looked at what she was working on without demanding an explanation, and they spent 2 hours going over the numbers together, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world, which surprised her more than she wanted to admit. The rotating grazing was working. She could see it in the grass recovery. Sections that had been grazed down to nothing in March were showing real growth by August. Dupree noticed it too. He didn't say anything to her directly, but she heard him mention it to one of the hands in the barn one morning, casually, the way men mentioned things they had decided were obvious in hindsight. The Longhorn breeding results would take longer to evaluate. That was the nature of the program. You didn't see the full picture until the calves came through in the following spring, and even then you were making judgments based on one season. She was thinking in 3-year arcs, 5-year arcs, the way the land itself thought, and she was aware that everyone around her was thinking in months, in the March banknote, in the immediate crisis of the drought. She tried to hold both timelines at once. It was exhausting in a way she hadn't expected. In August, the town happened. She had gone in for supplies with one of the younger hands, a boy named Ellis, who was 17 and still at the stage where he didn't know whether he should open doors for her or pretend he hadn't seen her. She liked Ellis. He was earnest in the way that young men were before the world had finished with them. She was coming out of the dry goods store when she ran into Vera Alderman, who ran the social committee, and whose opinion of Naomi had apparently not shifted since the wedding day. Vera was with 2 other women Naomi knew by sight, and they were standing in a cluster on the boardwalk with the very deliberate casualness of people who had positioned themselves to be encountered. "Mrs. Vance," Vera said with a smile that didn't involve her eyes, "how is the ranch managing?" "Well enough," Naomi said. "We've been hearing interesting things about your methods." Vera's smile shifted slightly. "Longhorn cattle. Goodness, I didn't know anyone still kept those." "Someone should," Naomi said pleasantly. One of the other women laughed, then covered it with a cough. Vera's smile tightened. "Well, I do hope it works out," Vera said. "Colton has had such a difficult time since Harold passed. The last thing he needs is additional complications." Additional complications. Naomi looked at Vera Alderman for a moment and felt the full weight of what the woman meant and chose not to pick it up and carry it. "I'll pass on your regards," Naomi said, and walked past her to the wagon. Ellis fell into step beside her without saying anything. When they were out of earshot, he said quietly, "She does that to everybody." "I know," Naomi said. "You didn't let her see it got to you." "No," she said. She climbed up to the wagon seat. "I didn't." But it had, a little. Not Vera's opinion. She had stopped counting Vera Alderman's opinion as a cost worth paying some time ago. What had gotten to her was the reminder that the entire town was watching and waiting, and not in the way that meant they hoped she would succeed. They were watching the way people watched a complicated piece of machinery they expected to break. Not with malice exactly, just with the patient certainty of people who had already made up their minds. She drove back to the ranch, and she looked at the land the whole way. The October cattle sale was the first real test. They brought 12 of the recovered Herefords to market. Not the Longhorn crosses, which weren't ready, but the animals from the improved grazing rotation, the ones that had had a full season of better management. Naomi had been tracking their weight and condition since June. She knew what she had. The buyers from Helena knew it too. Not immediately. There was the usual period at the pens where men looked at Vance cattle with the skepticism they had developed over years of watching Vance cattle come in undersized and underconditioned. But the numbers didn't lie, and these animals were 20–25 pounds heavier than the Vance stock those same buyers had seen in previous years. Colton was the one who handled the sales. That was right and proper. It was his ranch, his family name on the operation. Naomi stayed near the fence and watched, and did not insert herself into conversations she wasn't invited into. She had been at this long enough to understand the difference between the work that mattered and the visibility that other people needed. She watched Colton talk to the buyers, and watched the moment when the first serious offer came in. Watched his face, the way a muscle moved in his jaw, the way he kept his expression neutral with the practiced control of a man who had learned to negotiate from his grandfather. The offer was 40% higher than what the ranch had gotten at the fall sale the previous year. He didn't look at her. She didn't expect him to. But when they drove back from the sale that evening with the proceeds in the strongbox under the wagon seat, he said, after a long silence, "Tell me what you know about the Calder Longhorns. The genetics. She told him everything she knew. It took most of the drive home. He listened without interrupting, which was new. He asked 2 questions, both of them good questions, and she answered them honestly, including the parts where she wasn't certain, because she had found that pretending to more certainty than she had was a faster way to lose credibility than admitting uncertainty, and she needed her credibility intact for what was coming. What was coming was winter, and it arrived in November with a viciousness that the old-timers in town started calling historic before it had even properly settled in. The snow came first, a week of it, steady and deep. Then the temperature dropped to something that felt like the bottom of the world. Naomi had seen Montana winters. She had grown up in them. But this was the kind of cold that changed the light, turned the sky an odd flat white that pressed down on the landscape like a weight. The kind of cold that cattle were not built for, no matter how good the bloodlines. She had been preparing for it since September. The Northern Valley, Harold's Valley, she had started calling it privately, was stacked with hay she had ordered at Colton's reluctant authorization in August, when hay was cheap and the hands had thought she was being extravagant. The sheltered position of the valley, blocked from the worst of the north wind by the ridge, meant the temperature inside it ran several degrees warmer than the exposed pastures. She had the longhorn crosses and the strongest of the Hereford cows in there, tucked against the ridge, with enough feed to last 12 weeks if they were careful. The rest of the herd was in the main barn and the covered holding pens, crowded and unhappy, but alive. The first week, it was manageable. Hard work, constant vigilance, hands running themselves ragged in the cold, but manageable. By the second week, manageable had become something else. The temperature dropped again, another 8 degrees, and the hay in the south barn got wet when a section of the roof gave under the snow load and nobody caught it fast enough. They lost 2 nights of feed before anyone realized the extent of the damage, and by then a third of the hay in that barn was compromised. Naomi found out at 4 in the morning when Ellis came and knocked on her bedroom door instead of Colton's, because Ellis had apparently decided somewhere in the last 6 months that she was the one who would know what to do. She was dressed and in the barn in 10 minutes. The damage was real. She stood in the wet hay in the dark and did the arithmetic in her head, and it was not good arithmetic. They were looking at a shortfall of roughly 2 weeks of feed for the main herd, in the middle of a winter that showed no sign of breaking. She went back to the house and woke Colton. He took it the way she had learned he took bad news, standing very still and going very quiet while he processed it. He didn't rage, which she had expected initially and stopped expecting around July. He just went quiet and thought. Options, he said. Buy hay from Delaney, she said. He'll have surplus, he always does. But he'll know we're desperate and he'll price accordingly. How bad? Double what it's worth, probably. Maybe more. Colton's jaw tightened. What else? Reduce the herd now. Sell what we can before they lose condition. Take the loss on the price rather than the loss on the animals. In this weather, nobody's buying. The packing house in Helena is always buying, she said. Not at good prices, but they're buying. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the wind against the walls of the house, the steady, brutal sound of a winter that had decided to make a point. What would you do? He said. Both, she said. Sell the weakest 10 animals to the Helena packing house this week. Use that money to buy half of what we need from Delaney at whatever he charges, and stretch the rest by supplementing with the oat reserve from the north barn. She paused. It's going to be close. How close? She looked at him. She was not going to lie to him about this. I don't know yet. I won't know until I see how the temperature moves in the next 2 weeks. He nodded, once. The way he nodded when he had made up his mind and was done discussing it. Do it, he said. Talk to Delaney in the morning. She talked to Delaney in the morning. Delaney was exactly what she had expected. A decent man who smelled an opportunity and took it, the way decent men did when they had families of their own to protect. He charged her 2.25 times the going rate, and she paid it without arguing because arguing would have cost more time than it saved money, and time was what they didn't have. The ranch hands knew how bad it was. She couldn't keep that from them and didn't try. What she could do was make sure every decision she made in front of them was visible and deliberate and reasoned, so that they understood that someone was in control of the situation even when the situation was bad. Panic was contagious, and so was steadiness, and she chose steadiness every morning when she went out into the cold that turned her breath to vapor and her fingers to wood inside her gloves. Dupree had shifted by then. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened. Sometime in October, she thought, around the time the October sale numbers came in. He started coming to her with operational questions without going to Colton first. Not always, and not about everything, but often enough that she noticed. She suspected Colton noticed too, and she suspected Colton was not entirely comfortable with it, but he said nothing, and she didn't bring it up. Garrett was a different matter. She had been aware of Garrett's hostility from the beginning, the way you were aware of a stone in your boot, constantly, with low-grade irritation, adjusting your stride around it. He didn't do anything she could point to directly. He was just consistently, persistently resistant to everything she suggested, in the particular way of a man who had decided that his resistance was a matter of principle rather than personality. She caught him in the North Barn one afternoon in the third week of the worst cold, doing something she couldn't immediately explain. He was at the hay storage, her hay storage, the hay she had planned to the day to get them through the shortfall, and he was moving bales in a way that didn't match any work order she had issued. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. "Garrett," she said. He turned. The look on his face in the second before he arranged it told her what she needed to know. "What are you doing with that hay?" she said. "Just reorganizing," he said. "Making room." "Making room for what?" "The feed order from Delaney. It's coming in tomorrow. Needs to go somewhere." She walked into the barn. She looked at the bales he had moved. She counted them, or tried to, because they were stacked differently than they had been this morning when she had checked them herself. "How many bales did you move?" she said. He shrugged. "A few." "How many?" He looked at her with that flat expression she had come to understand was contempt wearing the mask of indifference. "I don't see why it matters." "It matters because I have that hay counted to the bale," she said. "And if any of it left this barn without my knowledge, that's not reorganizing. That's something else." The silence between them was the kind that had weight. Garrett was bigger than her by 50 pounds, and had been on this ranch for 10 years and did not like her, and had never bothered to disguise it, and she was aware of all of that, standing in the cold barn in the half-light, and she did not take a step back. "I want a full count in the morning," she said. "Every bale. Before the Delaney delivery." He said nothing. "If the count is right, there's nothing more to say," she said. "If it's not, we're going to have a conversation with Colton." She held his gaze until he looked away, and then she turned and walked back out of the barn into the cold. Her hands were shaking slightly inside her gloves. She was not sure whether it was the temperature or something else, and she decided not to examine the question too closely. The count in the morning was short by 9 bales. She went to Colton. He listened to what she said without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You're sure?" "I counted them myself yesterday morning," she said. "And again just now, 9 bales short." "Could be a miscount." "It could be," she said, "but I don't make miscounts." And his face when I found him in the barn was not the face of a man who had been reorganizing. Colton looked at the wall. She could see him working through it, the loyalty of 10 years against the evidence of the count, the weight of the winter, the cost of 9 bales in the middle of a feed crisis. "I'll talk to him," he said. "Whatever you decide is your decision," she said. "But I need you to know that if he stays on, I can't trust the feed management. And the feed management is the difference between us getting through this winter and not." He looked at her. "That's a hard line." "Yes," she said. "It is." Garrett was gone by noon. He left without a scene, which surprised her. She had expected a scene. Maybe he had expected her to back down, and when she didn't, he had decided a scene wasn't worth it. She didn't know, and it didn't matter. What mattered was the 9 bales, and the 7 more she found stacked behind the old equipment shed that afternoon, hidden under a tarp, which meant Garrett hadn't moved them off the property yet, and which meant her count was wrong. Not short, but displaced. She stood in front of the tarp and breathed the cold air, and felt something complex move through her, relief and anger and exhaustion in roughly equal measure. She restacked the bales herself, in the dark, with Ellis helping without being asked, and she did not say anything to Colton about the recovery because she needed him to know the problem she had solved, not the exact shape of how she had solved it. The winter ran for another 6 weeks after that, and every day of it was hard in the specific, grinding way that real difficulty was hard. Not dramatic, not climactic, just one problem after another requiring one decision after another, and no guarantees at the end of it. She moved through the days with the same deliberateness she had brought to everything since January, noting what worked and what didn't, adjusting, absorbing the losses that couldn't be avoided, protecting what could be protected. She was not graceful about it. She was tired and often cold and occasionally wrong, and she had to backtrack on two decisions in February that she had been certain about in January, and the backtracking cost time and some credibility with the hands who had watched her make those calls. She backtracked anyway, because being wrong was less expensive than staying wrong, and she had never cared very much about the appearance of certainty. By the time March arrived and the cold began to release its grip in the slow, grudging way of Montana springs, she knew the shape of what they had gotten through. The herd was thinner than she wanted. They had lost 7 animals in the worst stretch, not to starvation, but to the compounded effects of cold and stress, and the weakness that came from a season of hard conditions. 7 was not catastrophic. 7 was survivable. The longhorn crosses in the northern valley had come through almost untouched. She walked the valley on the first morning in March when the temperature climbed back above freezing, and she looked at those animals, Lincoln's offspring and Douglas's, the hybrid crosses that nobody in the territory had wanted to look at twice, and they were standing in the pale early light looking back at her with the same dark, intelligent patience they had arrived with. She put her hand on the fence rail and looked at them for a long time. Behind her she heard footsteps in the snow and turned to find Colton coming up the ridge trail. He stopped beside her at the fence and looked at the valley without speaking. After a while she said, "They made it." "I can see that," he said. "The calves will come in April. We'll be able to evaluate the first crosses then." He nodded. He was looking at the animals the way she had learned to recognize, not the look he had when he was assessing something for sale, but the look he had when something had surprised him and he was still deciding what to do with the surprise. "The hands are talking," he said. "About what?" "About you." He paused. "About how the Valley herd made it when the Morrison Ranch lost 30% of their stock. And the Hanley operation. And Delaney, who had all that surplus hay, lost 18 animals in the last cold snap." She hadn't known about Delaney. "That's unfortunate," she said, and meant it. "They're saying your methods work," Colton said. "The hands." She looked at him. He was still watching the cattle. "Dupree thinks you're the best stockman he's ever worked with," Colton said. "He didn't say that to me. He said it to Ellis, who has no idea how to keep his mouth shut." She was quiet for a moment. "Dupree is generous." "Dupree is not generous," Colton said. "He's the least generous person I know. If he said it, he meant it." The morning light was changing, the flat white of deep winter giving way to something warmer, the suggestion of a color that had been gone for months. She looked at it and felt the weight of the last 4 months shift slightly, not lift exactly, but rearrange itself into something that bore differently. "We still have the March note," she said. "Yes. And we still need to have a conversation about the fall breeding program." "I know. And the waterline repairs I said we needed in April last year still need to happen." "Naomi," he said. She stopped. He was looking at her now, directly, the way he rarely did, not with the measuring look, not with the controlled neutrality he used in negotiations, but with something that had no management in it. It startled her. "I know," he said again. "All of it. I know." She held his gaze and didn't say anything. "I was wrong about a lot of things," he said. "About the South pasture, about the longhorns, about what you would be." He paused. "About what you are." She thought about what to say to that, and she thought about it long enough that the moment shifted and she let it go. "The March note," she said quietly. "That's where we should start." He looked at the valley for another moment, at Lincoln and Douglas, and their crosses standing in the pale morning, surviving because she had brought them here and put them where the ridge would shelter them from the worst of it. "All right," he said, "the March note." They walked back to the house together through the melting snow, not speaking, the space between them different from what it had been in January, different in a way that she couldn't quite name and was not yet ready to. The March note got paid. Not comfortably, not with anything left over, but it got paid, and Aldrich stamped the receipt with the particular satisfaction of a man who had not been certain that would happen. Naomi sat across from him in his office while Colton signed the papers, and she watched the banker's expression and thought about what it would look like in 6 months, in a year, when the longhorn crosses came to market for the first time. She was thinking in those longer arcs again. She couldn't stop herself. The spring calves came in April the way she had predicted, and the first crosses from Lincoln and Douglas were everything she had hoped, and a few things she hadn't anticipated. They were bigger than the straight Hereford calves by a margin that even the hands noticed without being told. Their legs were longer, their frames heavier through the shoulder, and they had the longhorn constitution, the hard-boned, weather-indifferent toughness that didn't come from careful management, but from genetics that had been proving themselves on difficult ground for generations. Dupree stood at the fence of the northern valley and looked at them for a long time. "I'll be damned," he said, quietly enough that she almost didn't hear it. "They'll need another season before we know the full picture," she said, "but the frame is right." "The frame is more than right." He looked at her sideways. "Where did you learn this? Your father ran wheat." "I read," she said, "and I paid attention to things people threw away." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he had decided something. "Morrison's foreman was asking about you at the feed store last week. Wanted to know what we were doing different." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Dupree said. "Figured that was your call." She appreciated that more than she told him. The news about the Morrison and Hanley losses had spread through the ranching community the way bad news always spread, fast, and with the particular edge that came when people who had been confident turned out to have been wrong. Morrison had lost 31 animals in the last cold snap, Hanley 24. Delaney, who had sold her hay at 2.25 times the going rate and believed himself positioned well, had lost 18 of his own when the last freeze hit pastures he had assumed were protected. The Territorial Cattlemen's Association met in May, as it did every year, and for the first time in the 4 years the association had been meeting, someone brought up the Vance Ranch not as a cautionary tale, but as a question. Naomi was not at the meeting. Women did not attend the Territorial Cattlemen's Association, which was a fact she accepted the same way she accepted the weather, as a condition of the environment rather than a personal grievance. But Colton was, and he came home that evening and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "They asked about the grazing rotation." She looked up from the ledger. "Who did?" "Ferris, from the Copper River operation, and a man named Beaumont who bought the old Tanner land last fall. They'd heard things." "What did you tell them?" He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "I told them it was my wife's program and they should talk to her." The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was something more careful than that. "Colton," she said. "It's true," he said. "It's your program. I'm not going to stand in a room full of men and take credit for something I fought you on for 6 months." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. It's just the truth." He picked up the edge of the ledger and looked at the numbers. "Beaumont's going to come out here and ask you directly. I told him that was his prerogative." "When?" "Next week, probably." "He's eager." She thought about that. A visitor, a serious rancher asking serious questions, was a different kind of moment from being asked about methods at a feed store. It was the beginning of something. She wasn't sure exactly what, but she could feel the shape of it, the way you could feel a shift in the weather before the sky showed any evidence. "I'll talk to him," she said. Beaumont came on a Thursday, which was a working day on the ranch the same as any other, and Naomi met him in the yard in her working clothes with mud on her boots and no apology for either. He was a compact, serious-faced man in his 50s who had made his money in Colorado and come north looking for better land, and he had the eyes of someone who had been fooled before and learned from it. He looked at the northern valley for a long time. He looked at the rotation board in the barn. He asked 12 questions, and she answered all 12 without dressing anything up, including the losses and the mistakes, and the 2 decisions she had reversed in February, because men like Beaumont had heard enough sales pitches to smell one from a distance, and she was not selling anything. When he left, 2 hours later, he shook her hand, not Colton's, hers, and said he'd be in touch. She watched his wagon go down the road and felt Colton standing behind her. "You told him about the February reversals," he said. It was not a criticism. It was more like he was working something out. "Yes. Most people wouldn't. Most people are trying to seem more certain than they are," she said. "I'm trying to get the program right. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's going to copy the rotation." I know. Doesn't that bother you? She considered that. If it works for him, it works for the territory. Better managed ranches mean a better market. I can't patent grass recovery. She went back to work, and she was aware that he stood there a moment longer before he followed. It was the end of May when she first heard the name Hargrove Syndicate. She heard it from Ellis, who had heard it from a hand at the Copper River operation who had been in a Helena bar and overheard a conversation he probably wasn't supposed to hear. The chain of transmission was long enough that she handled it as rumor until she could verify it, but the shape of what Ellis reported was specific enough to be worth verifying quickly. The Hargrove Syndicate, as Ellis relayed it, was a cattle and land investment group out of Chicago that had been quietly buying up debt on struggling Montana operations for the past 18 months. Not buying the land outright, buying the debt, which was a different instrument with different implications. They had acquired notes on 7 properties that Ellis knew of, possibly more. Naomi went back to Aldrich. "How much of what Ellis is saying is accurate?" she said, sitting across the desk from him with the directness she had learned he responded to better than anything else. Aldrich was quiet for long enough to tell her what she needed to know. "I can't speak to the specifics of other operations' financial arrangements," he said carefully. "I'm not asking about other operations. I'm asking about ours." He looked at her. "The Vance note was held by First Territorial Bank. I personally handled the transaction. Your March payment cleared it." "So we're not one of the 7. "You are not," he said. She sat with that for a moment. "Who are?" "Naomi." "Aldrich." Another long pause. He was a man who took his professional obligations seriously, and she respected him for it, which was why she was sitting in his office asking him directly instead of trying to find out another way. "I can tell you that the operations most exposed are the ones that came through winter worst," he said, "and that the terms the syndicate attaches to acquired debt are not friendly. They include operational control clauses." Operational control clauses. She understood what that meant. It meant you kept the land on paper while someone else told you what to do with it. And the someone else was a group of men in Chicago who had never set foot on Montana soil and whose interest in cattle was entirely arithmetical. "Morrison," she said. Aldrich said nothing. "And Hanley," she said, "and probably the Tanner land that Beaumont bought, which means Beaumont bought into something he didn't know about." "I would recommend you discuss this with Colton," Aldrich said, "and I would recommend you do it soon." She discussed it with Colton that evening. He listened to the whole of it, and then he stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his hands on the sill, looking out at the yard. "If they get Morrison and Hanley both," he said, "they control the northern water access." She had been hoping he would see that on his own, and he had. "The creek that runs through our northern valley has its headwaters on Morrison land," she said. "If the syndicate takes operational control of Morrison, they control the upstream water. They can divert it, restrict it, make it a condition of any agreement they want to negotiate with us. We're not in debt to them." "Not yet," she said, "but there are ways to put pressure on a solvent operation if you control the water." He turned from the window. His face had the set look it got when something had moved from hypothesis to reality and he was adjusting to the new territory. "What do you want to do?" She had thought about this on the ride back from Aldrich's office. "We need to talk to Morrison, not to warn him. It may be too late to warn him, but to understand where he actually stands and whether there's any possibility of coordinating." "Morrison hasn't spoken to me civilly since the fall sale," Colton said. "He thinks we made him look bad in front of the Helena buyers." "He made himself look bad," she said. "But that's not useful right now. Do you think he'll talk?" "If you ask him, maybe," Colton said. "He's less angry at you than he is at me." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you're not competition," he said. And she heard something complicated in his voice when he said it. In his mind, "You're a woman who happened to get her methods right. I'm a Vance who showed him up." She thought about the particular stupidity of pride and how much it cost everyone who came near it. "I'll go see Morrison tomorrow," she said. Morrison's ranch was a half-day's ride north, past the creek junction where the Vance water line began. She went alone, which Colton had objected to and then stopped objecting to when she pointed out that showing up with her husband would make it a confrontation rather than a conversation. She had been to the Morrison property once, in February, to pick up some equipment they had borrowed during the worst of the cold. It had looked diminished then. It looked worse now. The kind of diminishment that happened not from a single disaster, but from the accumulated weight of a winter that had taken more than it left. Morrison himself met her in the yard. He was a tall man, raw-boned, with the look of someone who had not been sleeping well. He was polite to her, which she had expected. She had noticed that men who were contemptuous of her in groups were often different when encountered alone, as if the contempt required an audience. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "this is unexpected." "I hope the ride over is worth your time," she said. "I'd like to talk to you about the Hargrove Syndicate." The change in his face was immediate. Not panic. He was too experienced for panic, but a tightening, a closing, the face of a man who has had a door opened on a room he didn't want anyone to see. "Come inside," he said. They sat at his kitchen table, which was less organized than hers, with the particular disorder of a household where something had gone wrong and the ordinary maintenance of things had stopped being a priority. She looked at none of it and talked to him directly. His situation was what she had feared. The syndicate had acquired his note in January, 6 weeks before his March payment was due, and had reached him before he had time to arrange alternatives. The terms included an operational review clause. They had the right to appoint an observer to all ranch decisions above a certain dollar threshold, and that observer reported back to Chicago. "His name is Croft," Morrison said. "He showed up in April. He doesn't know cattle. He knows leverage." "What do they want?" Naomi said. Morrison looked at his hands on the table. "They want the northern grazing corridor, the strip that runs from my land through Hanley's and connects to the old mountain trail." He paused. "They're not interested in ranching. They're interested in running their own operation along that corridor, and they need the existing operators out of the way to do it cleanly." "They'd rather have the land than the debt," she said. "Yes. And if we default, they get it. And there are ways to encourage a default without doing anything that looks illegal." He looked at her. "Restricting our water access is one of them." She had known this was coming, but hearing it stated plainly by a man who was living, it was different from theorizing about it in her kitchen. "Who else?" she said. "Hanley's already gone," Morrison said. "Signed over operational control last month. He didn't have a choice by then. The winter took him too deep." He rubbed the back of his neck. 3 smaller operations east of the creek. They don't know yet what they've gotten into." "Beaumont," she said. Morrison shook his head. "Beaumont bought clean. He's not exposed." A pause. "He came and talked to me last week, actually, about your grazing methods." She absorbed that. "Morrison," she said, "is there anything salvageable in your position?" He was quiet for a long time. "If I could make the next note in July," he said, "real payment, not an extension. Croft can't do anything if I'm current on the terms. The operational review clause only triggers on default." "How much is the July note?" $4,200. She sat with that number. $4,200 was not a number she could produce from what the ranch had, not in July, not without selling animals they couldn't afford to sell before fall. But Beaumont might. "Would you accept a loan from a neighboring operation?" she said. "At fair terms. Documented properly." Morrison looked at her with the expression of a man who had been too proud too long and had run out of places to put the pride. "That depends on the terms," he said. "Fair terms," she said again. "This isn't charity. If the syndicate gets your northern corridor, they're 3 miles from our water source. Our interest in your solvency is entirely practical." He almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was something. "You talk like a banker." "I talk like someone who's read too many of them," she said. She rode back to the Vance ranch with the full shape of the problem in her head and a rough outline of what she was going to propose to Colton and Beaumont, and whether she could get the timing right, and she was so deep in the calculations that she was halfway across the south pasture before she noticed the rider coming toward her on the ranch road. She didn't recognize him immediately. He was moving fast, which was unusual for mid-afternoon, and when he got close enough she saw it was one of the younger Vance hands, a boy named Tate, who had been hired in March and had the overager manner of someone still trying to prove himself. "Mrs. Vance," he said, pulling up. "Mr. Dupree sent me. There's a problem at the North Pass." She felt something tighten in her chest. "What kind of problem?" 3 of the Longhorn crosses got through the fence, up the ridge trail. Dupree's not sure how far they went, but the trail goes up into the mountain section and he's... Tate paused, trying to organize what he'd been told. "He's worried about bringing them back down in the dark." She looked at the sun. 3 hours of good light, maybe 4 if they moved. Go tell Dupree I'm coming, she said, and tell him to wait for me before he sends anyone up that trail. She had told Dupree to wait because she had been up the ridge trail twice on her own, in winter and in early spring, and she knew something Dupree didn't know. The trail that went up past the northern fence, the trail everyone assumed dead-ended against the mountain face, didn't dead-end. It bent west around a granite outcropping that wasn't visible from below and opened into a second valley, longer and broader than the first, that she had found by following the cattle tracks in March, when she had been walking the fence line alone in the pre-dawn. She had told no one. She had not been ready. She was ready now, or at least the situation had decided it for her. Dupree was at the fence with Ellis and two other hands when she arrived. The gap in the fence was clear. A section of old wire that had rusted through at the post, probably over the winter, and the longhorn crosses had found it the way cattle always found weaknesses, with the patient thoroughness of animals that had nothing else to do. Tracks go up, Dupree said. 3 animals by the look of it, maybe 2 hours ahead of us. I know where they went, she said. Dupree looked at her. You've been up this trail? Yes. Past the rock face. Yes. He took that in. There's another valley up there. Yes. I was quiet for a moment, processing the information and what it meant that she had held it. She watched him decide not to ask why. Is it crossable in the dark? He said. The trail is, if you know it, but we don't need to go in the dark if we leave now. She looked at the hands. Ellis, you come with me and Dupree. You two, she looked at the other two. Fix the fence before you lose the light. She went through the gap first and up the trail, which was steep enough in the initial section that the horses had to pick their way carefully, and she talked Dupree through the turn at the granite outcropping and the way the trail opened up on the other side. Ellis was behind Dupree, quiet the way. He was quiet when he was paying close attention to something. The second valley was everything she had seen in March and more, now that the spring grass had come in. It was wider than the northern valley by half again, sheltered on 3 sides by the mountain ridgeline, with a snowmelt creek running along the east edge that was clean and cold and showed no sign of the silting problems she had spent months fighting on the main water line. The grass was tall enough to brush the horses' fetlocks. The 3 longhorn crosses were in the middle of it, grazing with the unconcerned air of animals that had found exactly what they were looking for. Dupree stopped his horse and looked at the valley for a long time. How long have you known about this? He said. Since March, she said. Why didn't you say? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I needed to think through what it meant before I showed anyone. A valley this size, this sheltered, if we use it wrong, we don't get a second chance. And in March, I didn't have the standing to make that call. Dupree looked at her. And now? She looked at the valley, the grass, the creek, the mountain walls holding out the wind. She thought about Morrison's $4,200 and Hargrove Syndicate and the corridor they were building through the northern range, and Colton standing at the window the night before with his hands on the sill, seeing the same thing she was seeing. Now things are different, she said. They brought the 3 cattle back down the trail in the last of the afternoon light, easy enough once they were found and pointed in the right direction. Ellis was careful with them on the steep section, talking to them in the low, steady voice he used with nervous animals, and they came through without trouble. On the way back to the ranch house, riding beside Dupree in the evening quiet, she said, I want to show Colton the valley tomorrow. He doesn't know, Dupree said. No. A pause. You should have told him before me. I know, she said. I'm telling him tomorrow. Dupree rode without speaking for a moment. Then, that valley changes the calculus on the syndicate problem. She looked at him. You know about the syndicate. I know about most things on this ranch, he said. I just wait to see whether anybody's going to do something about them before I say anything. She absorbed that. Dupree, she had come to understand, was a more complicated man than he appeared. He had been running the day-to-day of this operation for 15 years with a foreman's thoroughness and a foreman's careful relationship to authority, and some of what she had mistaken initially for resistance had actually been the patience of a man who had learned not to invest in plans that were going to change. He had decided to invest in her somewhere around October. She had not fully recognized it at the time. The valley triples our viable grazing capacity, she said. If we expand the Longhorn Cross program, which we can do now that we know the breeding results, and use the second valley for the expansion herd while we rest and recover the lower pastures. You'd be selling 3 times the stock by the year after next, Dupree said. Closer to 2.5, she said. But yes, he was quiet again. And if you're that solvent, you can make Morrison a real offer. A real documented loan, she said, with Beaumont participating. Spread the risk, formalize the terms, do it through Aldrich so it's clean. The syndicate will push back, Dupree said. They don't like losing a piece they've already claimed. I know, she said. What do you do when they push back? She looked at the road ahead, the familiar shape of the Vance Ranch buildings coming into view against the darkening sky. I document everything, she said. Every conversation, every transaction, every threat. And I find out exactly what legal exposure they have for acquiring debt with the intent to force operational control. Because that is not a practice without exposure if someone bothers to look at it properly. Dupree made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You've already talked to a lawyer about this. I've been reading, she said. I haven't talked to anyone yet. I wanted to understand it myself first. And do you? Enough, she said. Aldrich will fill in the rest. They came into the yard as the last light went. Colton was at the fence talking to one of the hands, and he looked up when they rode in and read something in her face, because he said something quick to the hand and came toward them. You found the animals, he said. Yes, she said, and something else. She dismounted and handed Ellis the reins. I need to show you something tomorrow, early, before the hands are out. Colton looked at her steadily. How early? Sunrise, she said. He nodded. He didn't ask what it was. That restraint cost him something. She could see it, but he held it. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and wrote out everything she had learned from Morrison. In the clean, methodical way she wrote everything. And then she wrote out the proposal she was building. The valley, the loan, Beaumont, Aldrich, the legal research she still needed to do. She wrote it all out because writing it helped her see where the gaps were. And there were still gaps, places where the logic depended on things she couldn't fully control. She worked until the lamp burned low. She was up before sunrise, which meant she was in the kitchen when Colton came down, and she had coffee ready, which he accepted without comment. They rode out in the gray pre-dawn, just the two of them, up the south pasture and along the fence line and up the ridge trail in the growing light. At the granite outcropping, she said, Stay close to the left face, the trail turns here. And she went through ahead of him, and she heard him follow, and then she heard him stop. The second valley was in full morning light, the snowmelt creek catching it, the grass moving slightly in the early wind off the mountain. He didn't say anything for a long time. March, she said. I found it in March. I was following cattle tracks on the fence line in the dark, and I almost walked into the outcropping, and I went around it to see what was on the other side. You've known since March, he said. His voice was careful, not angry. Working toward something, yes. And you waited. I needed to understand what it meant, she said, and whether I'd still be here long enough for it to matter. He turned and looked at her at that. She looked back. You thought you might not still be here, he said. In March, she said. I wasn't sure what we were yet, what this was. Whether you were going to decide it wasn't working and find a way out of the arrangement. She paused. I didn't want to show you something this significant and then have it taken away. He held her gaze for a long moment. She didn't look away. She had said it plainly because it was plain, and because she was tired of the particular energy it took to leave important things unsaid. I was never going to find a way out, he said. I know that better now than I did in March, she said. He turned back to the valley. She watched him look at it, really look at it, the way she had learned he looked at things when he was taking them seriously. How does this change our position with the syndicate, he said. She had expected that question. It changes it significantly, she said. Give me an hour. She talked and he listened. She laid out everything. Morrison's situation, Hanley's, the corridor the syndicate was building, the operational control clauses, the legal exposure she believed existed in their acquisition strategy, and the proposal she was building around the Second Valley, the expanded breeding program, the documented loan to Morrison with Beaumont as a co-participant. When she finished, the sun was fully up and the valley was in full light, and neither of them had moved from where they were sitting. That's a lot to ask Morrison to accept, Colton said. The loan terms. I know, but the alternative for him is worse. And Beaumont's a new man in the territory. He has no reason to commit that kind of capital to someone else's problem. He has the reason I gave him, she said, the same one I'm giving you. The syndicate getting the northern corridor is bad for every independent operation in the territory. Beaumont's smart enough to see that. Colton rubbed the back of his hand across his jaw, the gesture he made when he was working through something stubborn. And the legal piece, you're sure there's exposure for them? I'm not a lawyer, she said. But the acquisition strategy team, buying debt specifically to trigger default conditions and gain operational control of land they couldn't otherwise purchase. There are territorial statutes that speak to that kind of arrangement. Aldrich will know more, but I'm confident enough to start the conversation. He was quiet. The creek ran over its stones in the bottom of the valley. One of the horses shifted behind them. My grandfather, Colton said finally, would have liked this conversation. She looked at him. He's the one who put me here. I know. He looked at the valley. I was angry about it for a long time, that he didn't trust me to manage it on my own. He trusted you to manage it, she said. He just thought you'd manage it better with someone beside you who saw different things. He was right, Colton said simply. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. Set up the meeting with Aldrich, he said, and talk to Beaumont. I'll go to Morrison with you and don't argue. He needs to see us together on this, or it looks like charity. He stood up and brushed the grass from his coat. And the fence at the top of this trail needs to come down and be rebuilt to include this valley in the property boundary. I want it documented in the land registry before anyone else figures out what's up here. She stood too. That should take about 3 weeks. Make it 2, he said. I don't trust Croft's surveying habits. She almost smiled at that. She turned to get her horse. Naomi, he said. She stopped. Next time you find something significant on this land, he said, tell me. She looked at him over her shoulder, even if I'm not sure yet what it means. Even then, he said. She thought about that for a moment. The long discipline of saying things once and waiting, the habit of holding things until they were fully formed, built from years of being a woman in rooms that weren't ready to hear her. I'll try, she said. It was the most honest answer she had. They rode down from the valley together, back through the trail, back through the granite outcropping, back into the ordinary working morning of the ranch. The hands were coming out of the bunkhouse. Ellis was at the water pump. Dupree was already in the barn. The day was beginning, the way days began out here, without ceremony or announcement, just the slow accretion of work that had to be done. But the valley was up there, holding its grass and its creek, and its 3 seasons of untouched recovery, waiting for what she was going to build in it, and that changed the weight of the morning in ways she couldn't fully articulate and didn't try to. She unsaddled her horse and hung up the tack and went to find Dupree to tell him the fence needed rebuilding in 2 weeks. And she did not think about the syndicate or Morrison or Beaumont or any of the things that needed solving, because there was a time for planning and a time for work. And right now it was time for work. And she had always been better at work than almost anything else. That, at least, had not changed since January. Aldrich read the proposal twice before he said anything. That was his habit. Naomi had learned it over 18 months of sitting across from him in that paper-crowded office, watching him read things she had written with the same careful attention he gave to legal documents, which was the highest compliment he could pay anything. He read it twice, set it flat on the desk, and looked at her over the top of his glasses. The loan structure is sound, he said. The participation arrangement with Beaumont is creative but legally clean. The documentation requirements you've outlined would hold up to scrutiny. He paused. The legal argument regarding the syndicate's acquisition strategy is more complicated. Tell me where it's weak, she said. The territorial statutes you're referencing were written to address land fraud, not debt acquisition. The syndicate's lawyers will argue the two are distinct instruments, and they'll have a point. But, she said, because she could hear there was one. But, Aldrich took off his glasses and set them on the desk beside the proposal. There is a federal provision, commerce regulation, not property law, that speaks to coordinated financial interference with operating businesses. It's been used 3 times in the territories, never in Montana, and each case settled before reaching full adjudication. The syndicate's lawyers may not know it as well as they know the state statutes. Colton, sitting beside her, said, "Is that the argument you'd make?" "It's the argument I'd have a colleague in Helena make," Aldrich said. I handle property transactions and estate documents. This is the edge of my competence, and I know where that edge is. He looked at Naomi. But yes, that is the argument. How long would it take to develop, she said. Months to do it properly. The filing alone requires. We don't need to file it, she said. We need Croft to know we could. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he put his glasses back on. You want to use the threat of it. I want Morrison to be current on his July note, which removes Croft's trigger. Then I want Croft to understand that if the syndicate takes any action to restrict water access or interfere with operations in the Northern Range, there is a legal argument being prepared that will expose their acquisition methodology to federal scrutiny. She paused. I want them to decide the territory isn't worth the risk. Aldrich looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Colton. Your wife, he said, thinks like a chess player. I know, Colton said. I think like someone who's been losing at checkers for a long time and got tired of it, Naomi said. Aldrich almost smiled. I'll write to my colleague in Helena this week, and I'll prepare the loan documentation for the Morrison arrangement. Beaumont will need to sign independently. I'll need a meeting with him. Thursday, she said. I'll have him here Thursday. She had already spoken to Beaumont. She had ridden to his property 2 days earlier and laid the whole thing out for him with the same directness she had used with Morrison. And he had listened the way he always listened, with the careful attention of a man who had been wrong before and was not interested in the experience again. And at the end of it, he had said, How much do you need from me? She had told him. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, My foreman thinks you're the best stockman in the territory. Your foreman is generous, she said, which was what she always said. My foreman is a 20-year veteran who has never once used the word best to describe another human being, Beaumont said. What are the terms? She told him the terms. They were fair terms. She had made sure of that, not because fair terms were a strategy, but because she needed the arrangement to hold for as long as Morrison needed to rebuild. And arrangements that were not fair had a way of collapsing at the worst possible moment. Beaumont would participate for 40% of the loan amount. The interest was 3% annually. Morrison would have 3 years to repay, with no penalties for early settlement. And if he defaults, Beaumont said. He won't, she said. You can't know that. No, she said. But I know what his land is worth with the syndicate out of the picture and a proper breeding program in place. If he follows the rotation, and I intend to help him set it up, he'll be solvent within 18 months. The loan term is insurance, not expectation. Beaumont had looked at her with something that wasn't quite skepticism anymore, but hadn't fully become trust either. You'd help him set up the rotation, a competitor. A neighbor, she said. There's a difference. He had committed on Tuesday. By Thursday, he was in Aldrich's office signing the participation documents with the efficient manner of a man who had decided something and was not interested in reconsidering it. Morrison was there too, and the signing was not comfortable. It never would have been. Morrison was a proud man who had spent 20 years building something that a single bad winter and a predatory financial instrument had nearly taken from him, and sitting across from Naomi Vance and accepting the terms of a loan that her name was attached to required him to set down a pride that had been the organizing principle of his adult life. She watched him do it and did not make it easier for him or harder. She just sat there and let him do the work of it. When it was done, Aldrich notarized the documents and poured a small amount of whiskey for everyone, which Naomi accepted and held without drinking. Morrison looked across the table at her. My foreman wanted me to ask you something, he said, about the rotation schedule. Tell him to come by on Monday, she said. I'll walk him through it. Morrison nodded. He did not say thank you. She had not expected him to, not yet. Gratitude took time to arrive in men who had reason to resent the people they were grateful to. She was patient about that, too. Croft came to the Vance Ranch in June. She had expected him, and she had prepared for him, and he was still more unpleasant than she had anticipated, which she supposed was the point. He arrived without prior notice, which was itself a statement. He was a compact man in his early 40s with city clothes and the watchful eyes of someone whose professional function was to make other people uncomfortable. He introduced himself at the gate, told Ellis he was there on business with the Vance operation, and rode into the yard without waiting to be invited. Naomi was at the fence of the north pasture when Ellis came to find her. She finished what she was doing before she went to the yard, which took 4 minutes, and she let those 4 minutes stand. Croft was still on his horse when she came around the side of the barn. "Mr. Croft," she said, "I expected you to send a letter first." "My business is with Mr. Vance," he said. "My husband is in Helena," she said. "He'll be back Thursday. I'm happy to help you with whatever you need in the meantime." Croft looked at her the way men like Croft looked at women who were not where they expected to find them. "This is a financial matter," he said. "Then you're in the right place," she said. "Come inside." He hesitated. She could see him deciding whether to push and concluding that pushing in a yard in front of ranch hands would not serve him, and then dismounted and followed her into the house. She had the ranch ledgers on the table. She had the Morrison loan documentation. She had a letter from Aldrich's Helena colleague that had arrived 4 days ago, which she had read 3 times and which contained exactly what she had hoped it contained. She put coffee in front of Croft and sat down across from him and let him look at the documentation. "The Morrison note," he said after a moment. "He made his July payment." "Ahead of schedule," she said. "That wasn't—" He stopped. "Wasn't what you expected," she said pleasantly. "No, I imagine it wasn't." Croft looked at the loan documentation. He was a smart man. She had been counting on that. Smart men read documents rather than dismissing them, and smart men understood what the participation structure meant, that Morrison's solvency was now underwritten by 2 neighboring operations with their own resources and their own reasons to maintain it. "The Vance Ranch is a participant in this arrangement," he said. "Along with Mr. Beaumont," she said. "Yes." "That's an unusual arrangement." "Neighbors helping neighbors," she said. "It's fairly common out here. The Winters encourage cooperation." Croft set the document down. He looked at her with the eyes of a man recalculating. "The syndicate has interests in this territory that extend beyond individual operations," he said. "There are efficiencies to be gained from consolidated management of the northern corridor that benefit everyone." "I'm sure the syndicate believes that," she said. "I'd be interested to hear how they'd explain those benefits to a federal commerce examiner." The room went very quiet. "I beg your pardon," Croft said. She slid the letter from Aldrich's colleague across the table. She had marked the relevant section in pencil. 3 paragraphs that laid out the federal provision, the precedent cases, and the specific methodology by which the syndicate's acquisition strategy mapped to the elements of the statute. Croft read it. He read it again. She watched his face, and it told her very little, which meant he was better at controlling his expression than most people, which meant he understood what he was reading. "This is a preliminary legal opinion," he said. "The filing is preliminary," she said. "The argument isn't." "Filing with whom?" "The Federal Territorial Commerce Office in Helena. Mr. Aldrich's colleague is registered to practice before that body. We expect the initial review to take about 60 days. She paused. "Unless the relevant conduct changes, in which case the filing would be withdrawn." The silence stretched out between them. Croft looked at the letter. He looked at her. He was doing arithmetic, the kind of arithmetic that men like Croft did constantly, measuring risk against return, weighing the cost of a legal fight against the value of the territory. "The syndicate's interest in Montana is significant," he said. "I hope it remains so," she said. "Solvent, well-managed neighboring operations are good for a territory's overall land values. That benefits everyone with holdings here." She paused again. "Including the syndicate." Croft looked at her for a long moment. She looked back and did not move. He picked up his hat from the table. "I'll convey your perspective to the principals," he said. "Please do," she said, "and give them my regards." She walked him to the door and stood on the porch and watched him ride out of the yard. She stood there until he was through the gate and down the road, and then she went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Her hands were shaking slightly, less than the night she had confronted Garrett in the barn. She was getting better at this particular kind of steadiness, but it was still costing her something, and she thought it was important to know that it was costing her something and not pretend that it wasn't. She wrote to Colton in Helena that evening. She told him about Croft, factually, without drama, and what had been said and how it had ended, and she told him the letter was on the table if he wanted to read it when he got back. She told him the Morrison foreman had come on Monday as planned and had spent 4 hours learning the rotation and had left with a copy of the schedule written out in her hand. She sealed the letter and gave it to Ellis for the morning mail and went to bed, and she slept better than she had in 3 weeks. Colton read the letter in Helena and rode back 2 days early. He came in on a Tuesday evening, tired from the road, and he read the letter again at the kitchen table while she heated supper, and when he was done he set it down and said, "You should have waited for me." "Croft didn't wait," she said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you know the letter would be enough?" "I didn't," she said. "But I know men who do that kind of work. They're not ideologues, they're accountants. The territory stops being profitable if there's a federal inquiry and other operators consolidate against them. The math changes. And if the math hadn't changed for him, then we'd be having a different conversation," she said. "But I thought it would." He picked up the letter again. "Read the marked section. Put it down." "The Helena colleague, did he say how strong the argument actually is?" "He said it's stronger than the syndicate will want to find out," she said. "Which is not the same as saying it's certain. But it doesn't need to be certain. It needs to be expensive." Colton nodded slowly. "Aldrich trains you to think like a lawyer." "Aldrich thinks I was already thinking like one," she said. "He just gave me better vocabulary." He almost smiled at that. It was the full version of the almost smile she had been seeing more often lately, the one that got closer to his eyes each time. "Supper," she said, and put a plate in front of him. The fall sale that year was the moment the territory noticed. It was not a single dramatic thing. It was the accumulation of numbers, the way accumulation always worked, invisibly and then all at once. The Vance cattle came into the Helena pens, and the buyers from Denver and San Francisco, who had been dealing in Montana beef for years, looked at the Longhorn crosses and looked at the condition of the straight Hereford stock and looked at the weight reports and did the thing that serious buyers did, which was stop talking and start writing offers. The Longhorn cross calves, the first full season of the breeding program, came in 31 pounds heavier than the territory average on the open market. 31 pounds per animal across 47 animals, at current prices, was a number that Naomi had calculated 3 times in 3 different ways to make sure she had it right. She had it right. The competition among buyers was not violent or dramatic. It was the quiet competition of men who understood value and did not want to be the one who went back to Denver without having secured what they came for. Colton handled the floor negotiations the way he always did, steadily, without revealing what the floor was, letting the buyers find their own ceiling. He was good at it, better than she had expected when she first watched him work. He had the Vance poker face, the same one Harold must have had, and he knew how to use it. She watched from the side of the pens and kept her own count on a small piece of paper and calculated the running total and felt something she hadn't quite felt before, a specific satisfaction that was different from the relief of surviving a crisis. This was the satisfaction of a thing built correctly, producing what it was designed to produce. The final sale price per head was 42% above what the Vance Ranch had received the previous year, above what anyone in the territory was receiving, by a margin large enough that it stopped being a private matter and became a public one. Ferris from Copper River found her at the fence, while Colton was still in the pens. "Those crosses," he said, without preamble. "That's Lincoln and Douglas's first season." "Yes," she said. "I want to talk about purchasing a breeding pair from your next season's pool." She looked at him. Ferris was a capable rancher who had spent the last 18 months watching what she was doing with the careful attention of someone who had decided she might be worth watching. "That's a conversation for the spring," she said, "after I know what we have." "What would you want for them?" "A fair price," she said, "and a commitment to the rotation schedule. If you're going to use our bloodlines, I want them used correctly." Ferris raised an eyebrow. "You'd put conditions on a sale." "The conditions are what make the bloodlines worth buying," she said. "If you use them wrong, they underperform, and then everyone thinks the lines are weak instead of understanding it was the management. That's bad for both of us." He thought about that. "You want a management agreement." "A simple one. Nothing onerous. I'd want to visit the operation twice in the first year to look at the rotation and the grazing records." He looked at her the way men looked at her when they had arrived expecting a negotiation and found themselves in a different kind of conversation entirely. "All right," he said. "Spring." Beaumont was waiting nearby, and she talked to him next, and then 2 men she didn't know who introduced themselves as buyers from a Wyoming operation that was trying to expand northward. She talked to them for 20 minutes and then sent them to Aldrich's office for documentation. By the time Colton found her at the end of the day, she had had 7 conversations, and the sun was going flat gold over the Helena rooftops. Ferris wants breeding stock, she told him. I heard, he said. Two other operators asked me about the rotation schedule while you were talking to the Wyoming men. I told them to come to the ranch in October. He paused. I hope that was right. That was right, she said. He had her coat over his arm. She hadn't noticed the temperature dropping, which happened when she was working through something. And he held it out and she put it on, and they walked back to where the wagon was without the particular deliberateness that had characterized everything between them in the early months. It was easier now. It had been getting easier for a while, and she had not marked the moment it crossed over, which she thought was probably the nature of that kind of change. 31 pounds, he said. Average, she said. The top animals were closer to 40. He was quiet for a moment. My grandfather would have said something about this. I can't think what. She thought about Harold Vance, the two conversations, the careful architecture of a will designed to put her in the position to do exactly this. He'd have said he saw it coming, she said. Colton laughed. It was a real laugh, not the controlled almost version she had been watching develop for a year. He would have, he said. He was absolutely the kind of man who would have said exactly that. October brought visitors. Not all at once. They came the way things came out on the frontier, spaced out, word of mouth, with the particular mix of pride and desperation that characterized men who had been doing things one way for a long time and had recently received evidence that the way might be wrong. Naomi handled the visits the way she handled everything, practically, without ceremony, with the understanding that the knowledge was only valuable if it was used correctly. She walked people through the rotation schedule and the grazing principles and the thinking behind the Longhorn Cross program, and she answered questions honestly, including the ones that required her to say she didn't know yet, or that they'd tried something and it hadn't worked. And here was why. 3 of the operators who came in October were from ranches that had dealt with the Hargrove Syndicate, either directly or adjacently. Morrison was solvent now, ahead of schedule on his loan payments, and his foreman had become one of the more competent practitioners of the rotation she had designed. She had seen it on her visits. The man had a genuine aptitude once he understood the reasoning behind the schedule rather than just the schedule itself. She had been glad of that. Hanley was harder. He had signed over operational control before anyone had moved to help him, and the syndicate's man on his property was not Croft but a younger man named Peel, who was less experienced and more aggressive. The visits from other operators had put a new kind of pressure on the syndicate's Montana position. It was harder to squeeze one isolated operation than it was to manage a territory where multiple operators were talking to each other and sharing information and had a documented legal argument sitting in a filing office in Helena. She didn't know yet whether Hanley was recoverable. She was trying to find out without making promises she couldn't keep. It was Dupree who told her about the conversation at the Cattlemen's Association meeting in November. She hadn't been there, still not invited, which was a fact she had decided to address directly in the spring when she had more standing to do it. But Dupree had gone with Colton and had paid careful attention. They're calling it the Vance method, Dupree said. He said it without inflection, which was how he said things he knew were going to land hard. She looked up from the ledger. Who is? Everybody, he said. The rotation schedule, the Longhorn Cross program, the valley management. They're calling it the Vance method, and some of them are already saying they've been doing versions of it for years, which is not true. But that's what happens. She thought about that. They can call it whatever they want. You're not bothered, he said. I'm a little bothered, she said honestly, but not enough to spend energy on it. What matters is whether they're doing it right. Dupree looked at her with the look he used when he had decided she had said something that he was going to think about for a while. It was a look she had come to appreciate. Colton's bothered, he said. I know, she said. I'll talk to him. She talked to Colton that evening. I was in the barn checking the winter feed stores. They were well ahead of where they'd been the previous year, which was one of the uncomplicated satisfactions of this particular autumn. And he heard her out and then said what she had expected. You built it, he said. It should have your name on it. My name is Vance, she said. He looked at her. You know what I mean? I do, she said, and I appreciate it. But Naomi Harlow's rotation schedule would get adopted by half as many operators as the Vance method. The name that carries authority here is yours. I'd rather have the method spread than have the credit. He was quiet for a moment. That's very practical. It's also true, she said. I don't need the credit, Colton. I need the practices to become standard, because if they become standard, the territory's cattle improve. And if the territory's cattle improve, the buyers pay more. And if the buyers pay more, everyone benefits, including us. He looked at the feed stores. He looked at her. My grandfather saw this, he said. Not for the first time. He came back to it occasionally, the way people came back to things that still surprised them. He saw something, she said. I'm not sure he saw this specifically. He saw you were the kind of person who'd figure it out, Colton said. That's what he saw. She didn't answer that. She went back to the house and wrote up the notes from the day's ledger work, and she thought about Harold Vance and what he had seen and whether she was becoming what he had imagined or something he hadn't quite anticipated, and she decided she didn't need to know the answer. The work was the answer. The work was always the answer. Wasn't. The syndicate sent a different representative in November. Not Croft. Someone senior to Croft, a man named Aldous Whitmore, who arrived with a letter of introduction and a manner designed to suggest that the previous approach had been a misunderstanding and that the syndicate's interests were really quite aligned with the independent operators of the territory. Naomi read the letter of introduction and served Whitmore coffee and let him talk for 20 minutes before she said anything. What he was proposing was a cooperative arrangement. The syndicate would pull back from its operational control claims on Morrison and the three smaller operations, renegotiate the debt terms to something closer to market rate, and in return the Vance Ranch would withdraw the preliminary federal filing and not oppose the syndicate's proposed land purchases east of the Creek Junction. It was a better offer than she had expected. She had been prepared for something worse. I'm not able to give you an answer today, she said. Of course, Whitmore said. He was smoother than Croft, easier in his manner, which she was fairly certain was deliberate. I'd simply ask that you and Mr. Vance consider it seriously. The syndicate has no interest in prolonged conflict with the established operators of this territory. They have an interest in the land east of the Creek Junction, she said. A legitimate commercial interest, Whitmore said, not one that requires anyone else to suffer for it. After he left, she sat with Colton and Aldrich. She had asked Aldrich to come out for this one, and they went through the proposal piece by piece. Aldrich thought the renegotiated terms for Morrison and the smaller operations were real and enforceable. I was less certain about what the syndicate intended east of the Creek Junction. They want the eastern land, Naomi said. Whatever they said about the northern corridor, this has always been about the eastern parcels. The corridor was a way to acquire leverage to get them. Why? Colton said. Railroad, she said. Both men looked at her. There have been survey teams in the eastern range since August, she said. I asked Ellis to track them when I noticed the first one in September. They've been running lines in a direction that only makes sense if you're looking at a rail route. The eastern parcels are either in the path of the route or adjacent to it, and land adjacent to a rail route in cattle country is worth 3 times what it is today. Aldrich set down his coffee cup. You've been tracking survey teams. Ellis has, she said. He's 17 and looks like he's not paying attention to anything, which makes him excellent at paying attention to things. Colton looked at the ceiling for a moment. If there's a rail route coming through the eastern range, our position in the territory becomes significantly more valuable, she said, and the syndicate knows it. They want the eastern parcels now before the route is announced, because after the announcement the price doubles. The Vance land doesn't border the eastern parcels, Colton said. No, she said, but Morrison's does. And the 3 small operations. If those operators recover financially and hold their land, they benefit from the route. If the syndicate acquires them or retains operational control, the syndicate benefits. So the cooperative offer, Aldrich said slowly, is designed to get you to withdraw the federal filing and stop your support of the other operators. Not because the syndicate has changed its interests, but because they need time to move on the eastern land before the route is announced, she said. The filing is the only thing slowing them down. A federal inquiry would freeze any acquisitions until the investigation concluded. The room was quiet. Outside, the November wind was picking up, the particular edge of early winter coming back into it. You want to refuse the offer, Colton said. I want to counter it, she said. Not refuse it. Counter with terms that protect Morrison and the small operators' right to their eastern adjacent parcels, and that include a right of first offer provision if any of the syndicate's acquired parcels come to market. Aldrich looked at her over his glasses. That is an extremely aggressive counter. They want the filing gone badly enough to send Whitmore, she said. Whitmore is not a man they send on small errands. They want it gone before winter closes down the surveying season. She looked at Colton. We have more leverage right now than we'll have in February. Colton was quiet for a moment. He was doing what he always did, not rushing, working through it fully. She had stopped being impatient with it. It was how he had survived running this ranch through 7 years of decline without doing anything catastrophically stupid, and she had come to appreciate the value of a man who did not rush. Write the counter, he said. Show it to Aldrich first, then we send it. If they walk away, she said, then the filing stands and we see where it goes, he said. But I don't think they'll walk away. She didn't think so either. She wrote the counter that evening. She wrote it in the careful language she had been developing over 18 months of reading legal documents and asking Aldrich to explain the ones she didn't understand, and going back to read them again until she did. She wrote it 3 times before she had it the way she wanted it, clear and firm and specific about exactly what the Vance Ranch required and why. Aldrich reviewed it in the morning and made 2 changes, both small, both improving precision without changing intent. He handed it back with a look she had learned to read as approval. The counter went to Whitmore by rider that same day. The response came back in 11 days. The syndicate accepted 2 of the 3 terms. The right of first offer provision was modified to apply only to parcels within 3 miles of the creek junction rather than all of the syndicate's Montana holdings, which was a significant reduction, but not a meaningless one. She and Colton talked it over for an evening. She made the case for accepting, he made the case for pushing further, and they went back and forth for 2 hours in a conversation that was genuinely productive and occasionally heated, and ended with her saying, "You're right that we could push, but I think we're at the edge of what they'll absorb without walking away. And a partial protection is better than a filed complaint that takes 2 years and might lose." And him saying, "All right," and meaning it. They accepted. The federal filing was withdrawn in December. Morrison's debt was renegotiated to 3.5% over 10 years. The 3 smaller operations received similar terms. Hanley's situation remained complicated because Peel had dug in on the operational control clause in a way that Whitmore seemed either unable or unwilling to address, and Naomi made a note to revisit it in the spring from a different angle. The railroad survey was announced publicly in January. The route ran 11 miles east of the Vance property, close enough to matter, far enough that they weren't in the direct path of the construction disruption. 4 of the eastern adjacent parcels that the syndicate had targeted were now protected by the right of first offer provision. Morrison came to the Vance Ranch the week after the announcement. He came alone, without his foreman, and he found Naomi at the fence of the Northern Valley. She was there most mornings now, watching the second generation of crosses developing through the winter, and he stood beside her without speaking for a while. "The railroad changes things," he said. "Yes," she said. "For everyone in the range." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. "The provision you negotiated, the right of first offer on the syndicate's parcels." "A partial one," she said. "It's more than we had," he said. He stopped. She watched him find the thing he had come to say and pick it up. "I have not made this easy for you," he said. "Any of it, since last year." "No," she said. "You haven't." "I know that." He looked at the cattle in the valley. "I don't know how to—" He stopped again. "You don't have to," she said. "I'd like to," he said. "I'd like to say that I was wrong about what you were and what you were doing here, and that I'm aware the protection you negotiated benefited me as much as it benefited the Vance Ranch, and that my foreman tells me every week how the rotation is working and how he wishes someone had thought of it 20 years ago." She looked at him. He was looking at the cattle. "Thank you," she said. "Not for any one specific thing, for the whole of it." He nodded. He stayed at the fence for a few more minutes, watching the animals, and then he said goodbye and rode back the way he had come. She stayed at the fence after he left. The winter light was the flat, clean light that came after a cold front had moved through and left the sky scoured and the air sharp and everything at its clearest. The longhorn crosses in the valley moved through it like something she had built from an idea and patience and the stubborn refusal to accept that things couldn't be different from what they'd always been. She thought about her father's 40 acres, the depleted soil, the barn that needed re-roofing. She thought about the 2 conversations with Harold Vance and what he had seen in a 12-year-old girl talking about grazing patterns at a dinner table. She thought about Aldrich's office and the first morning she had driven out from town to a ranch that didn't want her, with mud on the road and the wind off the plain pressing against the wagon like something trying to push her back. She had not gone back. Colton came up behind her. She heard him on the frost-stiff grass and stopped beside her at the fence. Dupree wants to talk about the spring expansion, he said. The second valley. He thinks we can run another 60 head up there if we manage the creek access right. 70, she said. If we bring the fence line 15 yards east. He'll say 60. He'll come to 70, she said. Give him until Tuesday. Colton was quiet for a moment. Then, the railroad people are going to come and talk to us about land for the staging area during construction. I know. That's another negotiation. I know, she said. I'm already thinking about it. He looked at her sideways. You were thinking about it before the announcement. Since September, she said, when Ellis spotted the first survey team. He made the sound that was not quite a laugh. She had decided she loved that sound. She had not told him that yet. She was working up to it in the way she worked up to things, carefully, with the understanding that words said out loud had a different weight than words carried internally, and she wanted to be sure of the weight before she set it down. Come inside, he said. Dupree's waiting. Tell him to wait until I'm done, she said. He looked at her. What are you doing? Looking, she said. He turned to look too, at the valley, and the cattle, and the winter light on the creek, and the ridge that had sheltered all of it through the worst the season had thrown at them. He stood beside her, and they both looked at it, and neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't require filling. After a while, she pushed off the fence and turned toward the house, and he turned with her, and they walked back through the frost-stiff grass with Dupree waiting inside and the spring expansion to plan and the railroad negotiation to think through and the second season of Longhorn Crosses coming in April. And all of it was work. And the work was what she had always understood better than anything else. And standing beside her through all of it was the man she had married on paper and was building something real with, which was not what either of them had walked into Grover's office expecting, and which was, she had decided, one of the more interesting things life had done to her. The railroad negotiation took 4 months. Naomi had expected 3, which meant she had underestimated the number of men from the Chicago office who needed to weigh in on every decision before anything could be committed to paper. The Northern Continental Railroad Company sent 3 representatives to the Vance Ranch between January and April, each one with a different title and a slightly different version of what they claimed the company wanted, and she met each of them at the kitchen table with the ledgers and the land maps and the same patient directness she had developed for every other negotiation that had come through that door. What the railroad wanted was straightforward enough: a staging area during construction, access to the creek for water during the grading work, and right-of-way across the southeastern corner of the Vance property to connect their main line to the spur they were running toward the river crossing. What they were offering initially was a flat lease payment that assumed she hadn't looked at comparable arrangements elsewhere in the territory, which she had, extensively, through Aldrich's office and through a contact Beaumont had provided in Wyoming, who had dealt with the same company 2 years earlier. She asked for twice what they offered. They came back with 1.5 times. She held it twice. They sent the second representative. She held. They sent the third representative, a man named Calloway, who was senior enough that his presence was itself a concession, and she sat across from him for 3 hours and did not move on the core number, but agreed to a modified access arrangement that gave them what they actually needed for the construction phase in exchange for a permanent easement fee on the right-of-way that would run for the life of the railroad's operation. Calloway looked at her across the table at the end of those 3 hours with the expression she had seen on several men's faces over the past 2 years, the expression of someone who had arrived expecting one kind of conversation and found themselves in a different kind entirely. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "you should be negotiating railroad contracts professionally." "I'm negotiating this one professionally," she said. He signed the agreement. Aldrich notarized it. The railroad payment, combined with the fall sale proceeds and the breeding stock sales that had been building since Ferris had come to her at the Helena pens, put the Vance Ranch in a position she had not let herself fully imagine when she had been reading the ledger in the kitchen in those first weeks. They were not just solvent. They were, for the first time in the ranch's recent history, genuinely capitalized. with enough reserve to invest in the expansion without the fear underneath every decision that one bad season would unravel everything. She sat with the numbers for a long time after the railroad payment cleared. Then she went to find Colton. He was at the south pasture, which had been regraded and reseeded in the spring and was showing the kind of grass recovery she had projected 2 years earlier when she had first told him the pasture was the wrong place for calving. She stood at the fence beside him and looked at it. "We should talk about what we do next," she said. He looked at her. "I thought we were already doing it." "The expansion," she said. "The second valley is running at capacity. We have the capital to add a third breeding program. And there are 3 operators east of Morrison who've been asking to purchase breeding stock. We've been putting them off because we didn't have the inventory. We could have it by next fall if we move now." He was quiet for a moment. "How many animals are we talking about?" "Adding 40 head to the cross program, another 12 to the straight longhorn line." She paused. "And I want to hire 2 more people. Not hands. I want someone who can manage the rotation schedule across multiple properties. We're getting too many requests to do the consultation visits myself." Colton looked at the south pasture. "A range manager." "A range manager," she said, "and an assistant for the books. The ledger work is taking me 3 evenings a week." He turned to look at her fully. "That's a significant expansion." "Yes," she said, "it is." "What's the risk?" She had the numbers in her head. She always had the numbers in her head now. The way she had always had the grass recovery rates and the calving projections and the grazing schedules, everything running in the background while she was doing something else. If the market holds at current levels and the third breeding program produces at the same rate as the first 2, the investment returns in 18 months. If the market drops 20% and the program underperforms, we're looking at 30 months. She paused. "We can absorb 30 months. "We couldn't have said that 2 years ago," he said. "No," she said. "We couldn't." He was quiet in the way that meant he was not objecting, just absorbing. She had learned to read the difference. "Do it," he said. "Hire who you need, buy what you need." She nodded. She turned back toward the house. "Naomi," he said. She stopped. "When you came out here in December," he said, "that first day, when I drove you out from town and told you the ranch decisions were mine and this was not your choice." She waited. "I've been thinking about that a lot recently," he said, "about what I said, and how I said it." She turned around. He was still looking at the south pasture. "You were not wrong," she said, "about the facts of it." "I was wrong about most of what I meant by it," he said. "I meant it as a way of keeping you out. And you came in anyway." He paused. "Through every door I thought I'd closed." She looked at him for a moment. "I didn't break anything," she said. "I just waited for the doors to open." "You helped open them," he said. "Sometimes," she said. "Not always. You opened a few yourself." He turned to look at her then. There was something in his face that she had been watching approach for a long time, something that had been moving toward the surface through the spring sale and the railroad negotiation and the evenings at the kitchen table and the morning in the second valley when she had shown him what she had been keeping since March. It was there now, fully arrived. "I love you," he said. It came out with the directness of a man who had thought about how to say something for a long time and finally decided the plain version was the only honest one. "I'm not sure when that started. Sometime around the feed shortage, I think, which is probably not a romantic answer." She felt something in her chest settle the way things settled when they found where they were supposed to be. "It's an accurate answer," she said. "I'm more interested in accuracy than romance." "I know," he said. "That's part of it." She walked back to the fence and stood beside him. The south pasture grass moved in the warm May wind, the full green of recovered land, everything it had given back now returning. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. I was working up to saying it." He looked at her sideways. "Since when?" "October," she said. "Around the time of the fall sale. I wasn't ready to say it yet." "That was 7 months ago." "I said I was working up to it," she said. "I worked slowly on some things." He made the sound that was not quite a laugh, the full version, the one that reached his eyes. She had decided she loved that sound. She had now told him that she loved him, which meant she could also tell him that, and she did, standing at the fence of the recovered south pasture in the May wind, and he looked at her like she was the most unexpected thing he had ever encountered, which she supposed she was. and which she found she didn't mind at all. The Cattlemen's Association admitted women in the fall of that year. It was not a gracious admission. It came after 3 months of argument at the association meetings, argument that Naomi heard about through Colton and Dupree, and eventually through Beaumont and Morrison and Ferris, all of whom had apparently made the case in terms that ranged from principled to pragmatic. The pragmatic argument had been most effective, which did not surprise her. The pragmatic argument was simply that half the operators in the Northern Territory were now using the Vance method in some form, that the woman who had developed it was being consulted by operations from as far south as Wyoming, and that conducting association business without including the person most operators were copying seemed, at minimum, inefficient. The vote passed by a margin of 4. She attended her first association meeting in November, 6 days after the vote, wearing the same clothes she wore to work because she had not changed her habits for anyone and did not intend to start. She sat through 2 hours of proceedings in which she said nothing, because she was there to observe and because she understood that being present was itself a form of claim and she did not need to make additional claims on the first day. At the end of the meeting, Ferris moved that the association formally adopt the rotation schedule as a recommended standard practice for members. The motion passed. Nobody mentioned whose schedule it was, which was both predictable and fine. The point was the adoption. Walking out of the meeting hall, she found Vera Alderman standing near the door. Vera had been there as a member's wife, attending in the social capacity that had always been available to women while the decision-making capacity had not. She was dressed better than Naomi. She looked at Naomi with an expression that was not the expression she had worn on the boardwalk 3 years ago. "Mrs. Vance," she said. "Mrs. Alderman," Naomi said. A pause. "The rotation schedule," Vera said. "My husband has been using it since spring." "I know," Naomi said. "He came to see Dupree about it in April." Vera looked at her for a moment with the particular look of a woman who has been carrying a wrong for a long time and has finally decided the weight isn't worth the keeping. "I said some things," she said, "when you first arrived, on the street." "Yes," Naomi said. "I was unkind." "Yes," Naomi said again. She did not add anything. She was not going to perform forgiveness that she hadn't fully arrived at yet, because that would be dishonest, and she had built everything in this territory on the refusal to be dishonest about what she knew and didn't know. Vera nodded. It was a small nod, acknowledging what it was acknowledging. "Good evening, Mrs. Vance," she said. "Good evening," Naomi said, and went out into the cold night where Colton was waiting with the wagon. He read her face when she climbed up. "Vera Alderman," he said. She apologized, Naomi said, or the beginning of one. "How do you feel about it?" She thought about that honestly. "Like I need more time," she said, "which is fair to both of us." He nodded and turned the wagon toward home. Hanley came free in the spring of the following year. It took longer than she had hoped and went differently than she had planned, which was the nature of most things that were actually worth solving. Peel, the syndicate's man on the Hanley property, had dug in through the winter with the stubbornness of someone whose professional reputation was tied to the outcome, and the legal argument that had moved Croft had less effect on a man who had decided his personal credibility required him to hold the position. What broke it, in the end, was not legal pressure. It was arithmetic. The Hanley operation, under Peel's management, had a second bad winter. Not catastrophically bad, nothing like the historic cold of 2 years earlier, but bad enough that the cattle came through underweight, and the spring calves were poor, and the fall sale was going to be ugly. Meanwhile, every neighboring operation that was running the rotation and the cross program was reporting recovery rates that made Hanley's numbers look worse by comparison. The syndicate's Chicago principals, looking at the numbers, made the calculation that a badly managed Montana cattle operation with legal complications attached was worth less than a settlement that removed the complications. They sent Whitmore back. This time Whitmore came to Naomi directly, without stopping at the Vance Ranch first, which she took as evidence that the syndicate had learned something. She met Whitmore in Aldrich's office. She brought Colton and Aldrich and did not bring a lawyer of her own, because Aldrich was sufficient and because she wanted the room to feel less formal than it was. The settlement terms were what she had been waiting for. Full release of the operational control clause, renegotiated debt at fair market rates, and a buyback option that allowed Hanley to purchase the syndicate's interest in his notes at a fixed price over the next 5 years. She asked for one additional term that wasn't about Hanley. The 3 small operations east of the creek junction, she said. The same terms. Whitmore looked at her. Those operations are not part of this. I know they're not part of the Hanley arrangement, she said. I'm asking you to include them anyway. On what basis? On the basis that the syndicate's operations in this territory are going to be evaluated by every independent operator and every territorial authority with reference to how you handled this situation, she said. And the most visible version of your handling will be whether you applied the fair terms to everyone or only to the operation with enough backing to negotiate separately. Whitmore was quiet. It's not a large concession, she said. The 3 operations are small, but the signal it sends is significant. He looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at his desk. I'll need to confirm with the principals, Whitmore said. Of course, she said. I'll be here. The confirmation came back in 2 days. The terms were extended to all 4 operations. She rode out to tell Hanley herself. She had not had much direct contact with him through the whole process. His situation had been delicate enough that involving her too visibly early on would have added a dynamic that wasn't useful. But he deserved to hear the outcome from someone who had been working on it, and she was the one who had been working on it. His property was a half-day north of Morrison's, and she went alone again for the same reason she had always gone alone to conversations that needed to be simple. She found him in his barn in the early afternoon, a thin-faced man in his late 40s who had aged more in 2 years than most men aged in 10. He listened to what she told him without interrupting and without the careful expressionlessness that men used when they were trying not to show what they felt. He cried briefly, in the way that men cried when they thought they'd lost something and found out they hadn't. Not with sound, but with the particular stillness that came over a face when a held thing was released. She let it happen without commenting on it. The buyback option, he said, when he had pulled himself back. 5 years. At a fixed price, she said. Aldrich has the documentation. Come to his office this week. Why did you... He stopped. Started again. You don't know me. I know your land, she said. It's good land. The creek line on your eastern boundary is one of the cleanest water sources in the range. It'd be a waste to let it sit under bad management. He looked at her. He understood that she was giving him something to stand on that wasn't charity, and he took it. Thank you, he said. Use the rotation, she said. Come see Dupree if you have questions about the schedule. He's the one who teaches it now. She rode home through the late afternoon. The range was in full spring, the grass coming back everywhere that had been managed right and showing the consequence of management in the places where it hadn't. And she looked at all of it the way she always looked at land, as evidence, as argument, as the clearest possible record of what people had decided to do with what they'd been given. The territorial fair came in August, and for the first time in the fair's 12-year history, the livestock judging was complicated by a serious question of standard. The question was this. The Vance Longhorn crosses did not fit neatly into any existing category. They were not Longhorns and they were not Herefords, and they were not the mixed stock that had always populated the territory's operations. And the judges stood at the pens looking at the animals with the bewildered expression of men whose categories had stopped being adequate. Naomi stood nearby and did not offer to help them. They would figure it out or they wouldn't, and either way the animals were what they were and the numbers would say what the numbers said. The judges created a new category. They called it Improved Cross. She thought that was a reasonable name. It was accurate without being specific, which was the nature of categories applied to things that were still becoming. The Vance entries won the new category and also placed in the general beef class, which caused a discussion among the judges that she heard pieces of from across the pens, and which ended with a compromise that she suspected nobody was entirely satisfied with. That was also fine. Satisfied compromises tended to mean one party had given more than they should have. What she noticed at the fair was different from what she had noticed in previous years. The previous year people had talked to her after seeking her out, which was itself a shift from the year before that, when people had talked to her mostly because Colton was beside her. This year, people came to her first and found her whether Colton was there or not, and the conversations were different, not about the rotation schedule or the breeding program in the consulting way they had been, but about her opinion on things that were not directly her business. The railroad expansion east, the new territorial grazing regulations being discussed in Helena, whether the association should establish a collective purchasing arrangement for hay to stabilize pricing through bad winters. She had opinions on all of it. She shared them with the care she had always used, aware of what she knew and what she was guessing, honest about the difference. And the conversations lasted longer than they used to and ended with people writing things down, which was new. Ellis was at the fair with her because Ellis was 20 now and had been her assistant range manager for 8 months and had turned out to have an aptitude for both the technical and relational work that she had not fully predicted when she had given him the responsibility. He watched the conversations with the quiet attention he brought to everything. "People look at you different than they did last year," he said, in the afternoon when they were walking between the livestock pens. "Different how?" she said. "Like you're the person who knows," he said. He was still working on the vocabulary for what he observed, which was one of the things she liked about him. He didn't pretend a language he didn't have yet. "Like if there's a question, you're who they think of." She thought about that. "Does that seem strange to you?" "A little," he said honestly. 2 years ago, some of these same people were saying things, at the feed store and around. "I know," she said. "Doesn't it bother you," he said, "that they changed?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "I'd rather they changed than stayed the same," she said. "What bothers me is when the change is only about the success, when people would have seen the same things if they'd looked, but they didn't look because they'd already decided." She paused. "But being bothered by it doesn't undo the change, and the change is what matters for what comes next." Ellis was quiet for a moment. "What comes next?" he said. "The association's purchasing arrangement," she said. "I want to put a formal proposal together by October. Come to the office Monday and we'll start working on it." He nodded. He had learned not to be surprised when she answered practical questions with practical answers, even when the question had been about something else entirely. The fall sale of the 4th year was not a moment she had planned to commemorate. She had not planned any of the moments, really. She had been too busy building toward them to spend much thought on what they would feel like when they arrived. But the 4th fall sale was the one where the numbers crossed a threshold that she had written in pencil in the back of the first ledger she had used on the Vance ranch, in the kitchen in her first winter, as a kind of private estimate of what was possible if everything she was thinking turned out to be right. She had been conservative in that estimate. The numbers crossed it by 11%. Colton came home from the Helena pens with the final tallies and sat down at the kitchen table and slid the paper across to her without saying anything. She read the numbers. She put the paper down. She sat for a moment. "You knew before I read it," she said. "I've known since the last buyer closed," he said. "I've been thinking about what to say the whole ride home. And I don't have anything," he said. "That's bigger than what I know how to say about." She looked at the paper again. The number at the bottom was not just the sale total. It was what that total meant laid against the debt that had been here when she arrived, against the 7 calves lost in the first spring flood, against the 13 calves lost in the first bad winter, against Garrett's 9 displaced hay bales and the south pasture and the silted water line and Croft sitting across the kitchen table with his careful eyes. It was the answer to all of that. It was what 4 years of decisions, most of them right, and some of them wrong, and all of them made in the full awareness that she could be wrong, had produced. "It's enough to fund the eastern expansion," she said. "I know," he said, "and to build the permanent hay storage Dupree has been asking about." "I know," he said again. "And to make Morrison's remaining loan payments ourselves, if the market drops and he can't make them, which I think we should provision for." "Naomi," he said. She looked up. "Can we just sit with it for a minute?" he said. "Before the next thing." She looked at him. He was smiling. Not the almost smile, not the controlled version, but the full one that she had been watching become more frequent in direct proportion to how the ranch was doing and how they were with each other, which she had noticed were not entirely separate measurements. "All right," she said. She put her hand on the table. He put his hand over hers. They sat with it for a minute, the way he had asked, and she tried to feel what it was. Not the numbers, but what the numbers were made of. All the cold mornings and difficult conversations and decisions made without certainty in the direction she thought was right. It felt like something that had been built rather than won. She thought that was an important distinction. Things that were won could be taken. Things that were built became part of the ground. After a while, she said, "There's one more thing I want to do this fall." "Of course there is," he said. "The association purchasing arrangement. I want to present it at the November meeting." He looked at her. You've been working on it since August. Ellis has been working on it since August. I've been reviewing it. What does it do? He said. She laid it out. The collective hay purchasing agreement that would allow member operators to pool their buying power during good years to build reserves that could be distributed at cost during bad ones, with a rotating committee to manage the allocation and an arbitration process built into the charter for disputes. It was not a complicated mechanism. The complication was the trust required to make it function, and that was not something she could put in a document. It was something that had to be demonstrated. Colton listened to the whole thing. When she finished, he said, "You're not just running a ranch anymore." "I'm still running the ranch," she said. "You're running something bigger than the ranch," he said. "You know that." She did know it. She had known it since the conversations at the fair, since Dupree had started training range managers from other operations, since Aldrich's Helena colleague had asked to publish the outline of the Hargrove Syndicate legal argument in a territorial law review as a guide for other rural operators facing similar tactics. She knew it, and she had not been sure what to do with the knowledge, because it was a different kind of thing from what she had set out to build, and she was still deciding what it meant. "One thing at a time," she said. "The purchasing arrangement is the next thing," he said. "Yes. And after that?" She thought about Harold Vance's valley in the spring, the grass coming up through the snow melt, and the second valley above it, and the third-generation crosses that were going to market next year with the Vance brand. She thought about Hanley's Clean Creek water on the eastern boundary, and Morrison's foreman who came to see Dupree every few weeks like a student who had discovered he liked learning. She thought about Ellis at 20 with his quiet attention and his developing vocabulary for what he was seeing. After that, she said, there'll be something else. He looked at her with the look that meant he was content, which was a look she had not seen on his face in the early months, and which had become, quietly and without announcement, one of her favorite things about her life. "All right," he said. The November meeting was the largest the association had gathered in 6 years. People came from operations she hadn't expected, smaller ranches from the southern range that had been following the methods at a distance, 2 operators from across the territorial border who had been pointed toward the association by their own networks. The hall was fuller than it was built for, and colder than was comfortable because the doors had to be left open for the overflow standing outside. She presented the purchasing arrangement in 45 minutes. She had drafted it to be clear enough that a man hearing it once could understand its mechanics, and she presented it without the hedging language that made people doubt what they were listening to. She laid it out straight, answered 7 questions from the floor, acknowledged the 2 concerns she did not have complete answers to, and described how the Charter's arbitration process was designed to handle exactly that kind of unresolved question. The vote passed by 23-4. Walking out of the hall afterward, she passed Dale Pruitt, who had laughed at the Harvest Social a lifetime ago and whose ranch she had driven past 100 times without stopping. He was standing near the door with his hat in his hands. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, "Good work tonight, Mrs. Vance," in a voice that carried more weight than the words themselves. "Thank you," she said, and meant it without reservation, which surprised her a little. She was still working on the reservations. She was working on the Vera Alderman one too, slowly, the way you worked on things that required time and honesty and the willingness to extend something before you were entirely sure it was warranted. It was harder than the ranch work. It did not have a rotation schedule, and the results were less measurable. She was doing it anyway. Colton was waiting outside. He had heard the vote from the doorway. He fell into step beside her without speaking. 23-4, she said. Morrison voted yes, he said. I watched him. She nodded. Morrison had come to her 2 weeks earlier about the arrangement, not to ask questions about the mechanics, he understood those, but to ask quietly who the arrangement was designed to protect. She had told him honestly, the small operations, the ones that didn't have the reserves to survive a bad year without help, the ones that would be vulnerable to the next Hargrove Syndicate if they didn't have a structural cushion. He had nodded and left without saying anything else. He had voted yes. The 4 who voted against, she said. I want to know why. You're going to go talk to them, Colton said. Not tonight, she said. But yes. Why? Because they had a reason, she said. And if the reason is something I missed in the charter, I'd rather know about it. She paused. And because unanimous adoption next year is more valuable than a majority now. He was quiet for a moment. "You think in years," he said. "I think in the time the thing requires," she said. "Some things are months, some things are years." They reached the wagon. The night was clear and cold with the particular Montana clarity that came when the sky had no moisture left in it, everything sharp-edged under the stars. She climbed up and gathered the reins and felt the familiar weight of the work ahead, not as a burden, but as a structure, the way a well-built fence felt when you put your hand on it, solid and purposeful, and there, because someone had decided it needed to be there. "I've been thinking about something," Colton said, as they pulled out of the town square. "Harold's property in Helena," he said, "the house he kept there. It's been sitting empty for 3 years. I've been thinking we should do something with it." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "It has a good-sized room on the ground floor, large enough for a meeting space." He was careful with his words, which meant he had been thinking about this for a while. "I was thinking, if someone wanted to run educational sessions, for range managers, for operations that can't afford to send their people all the way out to the ranch." She sat with that for a moment. "A training program," she said. "Something like that," he said. "If someone wanted to build it." "You're talking about me building it," she said. "I'm talking about you deciding whether you want to," he said. "It's Harold's property. It's mine now. I can do whatever I want with it." He paused. "Including give it to you to do whatever you want with." She looked at the road ahead. The stars were enormous out here, the way they were enormous in Montana in November. The sky wide and dark and indifferent, in the way that land and sky were indifferent. Not hostile, just large, requiring people to be the ones who decided what they meant by it. "I'll think about it," she said. "That means you've already decided," he said. "It means I'll think about it," she said. But she was already thinking about it. The room, the sessions, the range managers from operations that were trying to learn what the Vance Ranch had taken 4 years of hard work and costly mistakes to figure out. She was thinking about how much time she had spent learning things in isolation that she could have learned faster with better information, and how much that isolation had cost, and whether there was a way to shorten that distance for the people who came after. She thought about all of this and said nothing more until they were through the town and onto the ranch road, and then she said, "The room, is it big enough for 12 people comfortably?" He made the sound. "I thought you were thinking about it." "I am thinking about it," she said. "Thinking requires information." 12, maybe 14, he said. "We'd need to run sessions twice a month," she said, "at minimum. And the curriculum would need to be written down properly, not just demonstrated. Ellis could help with that." "Ellis is 20, he said. "Ellis is good at explaining things," she said, "and he'll be better in a year." She looked at the road. 3 years to establish it as a regular program. 5 to see whether it's producing range managers who can sustain what they've learned on their own operations without ongoing support. 5 years, he said. "Minimum," she said. "Some things take longer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandfather would have loved this conversation." "He should have had it while he was alive," she said. "He'd have had better ideas." "He had one idea," Colton said. "He had it in his will. I think it covered everything." She didn't answer that. She thought about Harold Vance for a moment. The dinner at 12 years old, the conversation about grazing patterns, the loan he hadn't given her and the words he had, and then the will, the careful architecture of it, the $300 that couldn't be taken, and the 30-day clause and the specific name of a specific woman that an old man had been watching and thinking about for a long time before he put the pen to the paper. What Harold had seen was not what she had become. What Harold had seen was what she was capable of becoming, which was a different kind of vision and a harder one, because it required believing in a thing before there was evidence for it. She had spent 4 years producing the evidence, and the evidence was real. It was in the ledger and the breeding records and the valley grass and the votes in that hall tonight and the 4 people who had voted against who she was going to talk to next week. But the belief had come first. Harold had carried it first. And then she had carried it herself, alone in the early months when there was no one else to carry it, and then Colton had picked it up, and then Dupree in his own way, and then Ellis and Morrison and Beaumont and Ferris and the 23 votes and the operators standing in the cold outside the hall because the room wasn't big enough. That was how things built. Not from a single person's vision, but from the passing of belief from one set of hands to the next, each person carrying it for the stretch they could manage before someone else picked it up. She had not understood that at the beginning. She had thought it was solitary work, the kind of work you did inside yourself and then showed the results of. She understood now that the results were only possible because other people had made room for them, and that making room was its own kind of work. And it was the work she was most interested in doing more of. The ranch road curved around the south pasture, the recovered pasture, the one she had first known as a drainage problem and now knew as proof that things could come back from worse than anyone expected if you gave them what they needed and left them alone to do it. The Vance buildings were lit ahead, the lamp in the kitchen and the lantern in the barn where one of the hands was doing the late check on the calving pen. She pulled into the yard and stepped down from the wagon and stood for a moment in the cold night air, looking at the property that had not wanted her and that she had built into something neither of them had imagined. It was not finished. It would not be finished. The training program in Helena would take years. The 4 votes against would take patience. Hanley's buyback option still had 3 years to run, and she intended to make sure he got there. The association purchasing arrangement needed its first difficult season to prove that it worked, and difficult seasons in Montana were never far off. There was always more. There would always be more. That was not a problem. That was the nature of having built something real. It became the ground for the next thing, and the next thing was always waiting. Colton came around from putting the horses up and stood beside her. "Cold," he said. "Yes," she said. "Come inside." "In a minute," she said. He stood beside her without pushing, which was something he had learned or maybe always known, and only now applied. And she stood in the cold and looked at the land and thought about what it was to see something where other people saw nothing, and how that kind of seeing was not a gift exactly, but a discipline, a practice of attention that anyone could learn if they were willing to look long enough and with enough honesty to see what was actually there instead of what was easy or comfortable or already decided. She thought about the girl who had sat on her father's porch holding a lawyer's letter and looked out at 40 depleted acres and a barn that needed re-roofing and $112 of debt and said yes anyway. Not because the odds were good, because the alternative was standing still, and standing still had never been something she was able to do for very long without it costing her something she couldn't afford. She had not always been right. She had been wrong about the February decisions she'd had to reverse. She had been wrong about how long Croft would take to be moved. She had been wrong about Beaumont's timeline for committing to the Morrison loan, and about how quickly the association would accept a woman in the room, and about whether Vera Alderman was capable of something that looked like an apology. She had been wrong about things, and she had kept going, and the keeping going was not courage in the way people meant courage. It was not an absence of fear. It was just the decision that the work mattered more than the fear did, and that decision had to be made every morning, some mornings harder than others, right up to this morning, and presumably tomorrow morning as well. That was the honest version of it, not the version where a woman's inner strength made everything possible. The version where a woman was tired and cold and sometimes wrong and kept going anyway, and where the keeping going, accumulated over years and thousands of small decisions, eventually produced something large enough that people called it remarkable. It was not remarkable. It was just the work, done long enough and honestly enough, in good faith with the land and with the people who were willing to meet her in the same good faith. She turned from the yard and went inside to where it was warm, and Colton made coffee without being asked, and they sat at the kitchen table that had held so many ledgers and legal documents and difficult conversations, and outside the November wind moved across the recovered land, across the 2 valleys and the longhorn crosses and the hay stored properly for the winter and the fence rebuilt correctly along the ridge. And none of it required her attention right now, and she drank her coffee and let it be what it was, which was everything she had come here with nothing to build, built now, solid under her hands,